Judas Iscariot was handpicked by Jesus Christ himself to be one of the 12 disciples, yet he became the man who would sell out the Son of God for the price of a slave. This isn't just another Bible story. This is the psychological thriller of betrayal, greed, and lost faith that changed the course of human history. From his early days following Jesus and witnessing miracles firsthand, to the moment he led soldiers to arrest his master, we're about to uncover every detail of Judas's journey from devoted disciple to ultimate betrayer. What you'll learn about his true motivations and final moments will completely reshape how you understand this pivotal figure in Christianity. But before we get into it, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means we can continue providing these types of videos for you. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here. So, without further ado, let's dive in, shall we? A kiss that echoes through time. In the Garden of Gethsemane, shadows dance between ancient olive trees. A figure approaches through the moonlight, leading a crowd of soldiers and temple guards. Their torches flicker like stars fallen to earth. The man steps forward, his face familiar yet strange. A kiss touches the cheek of the rabbi from Nazareth. This moment freezes in time. The kiss hangs in the air like a question mark written in betrayal. Around them, the world holds its breath. Disciples scatter, guards move forward, and in that space between heartbeats, history pivots on the axis of a single gesture. The kiss belongs to Judas Iscariot. His name carries the weight of 2,000 years of whispered accusations. Every generation since has wondered about this man who walked beside Jesus for 3 years, then handed him over for 30 pieces of silver. What drove him to this moment? What thoughts raced through his mind as his lips touched the face of the one he called teacher? To understand this kiss, we must step back beyond the garden, beyond the supper table, beyond the dusty roads of Galilee. We must enter the world that shaped Judas Iscariot, the world that made betrayal seem like the only choice left. The story begins not with Judas, but with the land that birthed him. First-century Judea pulses with tension. Roman eagles perch on Jewish temples. Foreign gods demand worship from the chosen people. The weight of occupation presses down on every conversation, every prayer, every dream of freedom. Here, in this pressure cooker of politics and faith, a young man named Judas learns to navigate between worlds. He grows up hearing stories of ancient kings who drove out invaders. He watches Roman soldiers march through his streets. He listens to rabbis debate whether God has abandoned his people or whether deliverance waits just beyond tomorrow's sunrise. Judas becomes a man caught between hope and despair. His heart beats with the rhythm of rebellion. His mind calculates the odds of revolution. When he encounters a traveling teacher from Nazareth, something stirs within him. Perhaps this Jesus holds the key to liberation. Perhaps following him will lead to the restoration of Israel. The journey begins with faith. Judas joins 11 other men who believe they have found something extraordinary in this carpenter's son. They walk the dusty roads together, they share meals and stories, they witness things that defy explanation. Water becomes wine. Storms calm at a word. The dead rise from their sleep. But somewhere along the way, Judas's vision begins to blur. The kingdom Jesus speaks of doesn't match the kingdom Judas imagines. Instead of armies gathering, Jesus speaks of turning the other cheek. Instead of calling down fire from heaven, Jesus blesses those who mourn. The revolution Judas expects never arrives. Disappointment grows like a seed in dry ground. Questions multiply in the quiet hours. Why doesn't Jesus claim his throne? Why does he speak in riddles when direct action would serve better? Why does he waste time with tax collectors and sinners when righteous people need liberation? The final week arrives like a storm on the horizon. Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem. The disciples sense something building, something that will either crown their teacher as king or destroy everything they've built together. Judas watches. He calculates. He chooses. In the upper room, Jesus washes feet like a servant. He speaks of betrayal as if it were inevitable. He breaks bread and pours wine, creating symbols that will outlast empires. One by one, the disciples ask, "Is it I?" The question hangs in the air like incense. Judas asks too. The words taste strange in his mouth. Deep down, he already knows the answer. The decision has been made. The wheels are in motion. The kiss waits in the garden like a destiny he cannot escape. This is where our story truly begins, not with the kiss itself, but with the long road that led to it. The road that winds through the politics of ancient Palestine, through the heart of a man torn between loyalty and conviction, through the mystery of free will and divine purpose. The kiss in Gethsemane echoes through time because it represents something universal. The moment when friendship becomes betrayal, when hope transforms into disappointment, when the gap between what we expect and what we receive becomes too wide to bridge. Judas Iscariot stands at the crossroads of history, holding 30 pieces of silver in one hand and the weight of eternity in the other. His story is about to unfold, layer by layer, like the petals of a flower opening to reveal its hidden center. The garden waits, the kiss approaches, and somewhere in the shadows between faith and doubt, between loyalty and despair, a man named Judas walks toward the moment that will define him forever. The world before Judas. The sun rises over Judea like a fist clenched in defiance. Roman standards cast long shadows across the Jerusalem temple. In the markets, merchants haggle in 3 languages while soldiers watch from the corners. This is the world into which Judas Iscariot is born. A world where every breath tastes of occupation and every prayer whispers of freedom. Pompey's legions conquered Jerusalem 60 years before Judas drew his first breath. The Romans came promising peace, but their peace feels like a boot pressed against the throat of a nation. They allow the Jews to worship their invisible God, but only under Roman terms. The high priest serves at Caesar's pleasure. The temple treasury flows toward Rome's coffers. In this crucible of resentment, Jewish identity transforms into something sharper than it has ever been. The people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob discover that suffering has a way of crystallizing faith. They remember the stories their grandparents told. They recite the promises God made to David. They count the years since Daniel's prophecies and wonder if the time of restoration draws near. Religious parties emerge like different currents in the same river. The Pharisees build walls of law around the law, believing that perfect obedience will summon divine deliverance. The Sadducees make peace with power, choosing collaboration over confrontation. The Essenes retreat to the desert, waiting for God to cleanse the world with fire. And then there are the Zealots. These are the ones who sharpen swords in secret places. They believe God helps those who help themselves. They dream of another Judas, the Maccabee who drove out Syrian oppressors 2 centuries before. They whisper about the coming of an anointed one, a Messiah who will restore the kingdom to Israel. The very air of first-century Palestine crackles with messianic expectation. Street preachers proclaim the approaching kingdom. Prophets emerge from the wilderness calling for repentance. Wonder workers gather crowds with signs and miracles. Rome tolerates these movements until they threaten the peace, then crushes them with systematic brutality. Into this world steps a young man named Judas. His surname Iscariot may link him to the Sicarii, the daggermen who practice urban warfare against Roman collaborators, or perhaps simply marks him as a man from Kerioth, a town in the southern territory of Judah. Either way, he carries the weight of his people's hopes and frustrations. The economic landscape of Judea shapes character as surely as mountains shape weather. Small farmers struggle under crushing tax burdens. Roman publicans squeeze every denarius from the people. The temple system demands tithes and offerings. Ordinary families find themselves caught between competing claims on their resources. Trade routes crisscross the region like arteries carrying the lifeblood of empire. Caravans bring silk from China and spices from India. Roman engineering connects distant provinces with roads that will outlast the empire itself. Yet most Jews feel excluded from this prosperity. They remain spectators to wealth that flows through their land but never settles in their hands. Religious festivals become pressure release valves for a population living under constant stress. Passover brings Jerusalem's population from 50,000 to over 200,000. Pilgrims pour in from every corner of the known world. They come to remember liberation from Egypt and to pray for liberation from Rome. The temple dominates Jerusalem like a mountain of white stone and gold. Herod the Great rebuilt it to rival any structure in the empire. Yet this architectural marvel stands as a symbol of compromise. Roman money funded its construction. Roman approval sanctioned its completion. Even the house of God bears the fingerprints of foreign power. In the villages surrounding Jerusalem, life moves to rhythms older than empire. Farmers plant and harvest according to seasons their ancestors have known for 1,000 years. Women draw water from wells that Abraham might have recognized. Children play games that echo back to the time of kings. But even here, in these timeless places, the weight of occupation presses down. Tax collectors appear at harvest time, young men disappear into Roman auxiliary units, families split between those who resist and those who accommodate. The personal becomes political, the spiritual becomes revolutionary. Synagogues serve as more than places of worship. They function as community centers, schools, and courtrooms. Here, the law of Moses competes with the law of Caesar. Scribes and teachers debate not just theology, but survival. How does a people maintain their identity while living under foreign rule? The written word takes on special significance in this context. Torah scrolls become treasures more valuable than gold. The ability to read and interpret scripture marks a man as worthy of respect. Knowledge of the law provides both spiritual authority and practical power. Greek culture continues to influence Jewish life, even decades after the Maccabean revolt. The gymnasium still attracts young men seeking advancement. Greek remains the language of commerce and diplomacy. Philosophy filters into theological discussions. Yet this cultural blending creates tension. How much accommodation is too much? The calendar itself becomes a battleground. Romans organize time around their festivals and imperial celebrations. Jews measure months by the moon and years by the temple cycle. Even the simple act of marking time forces choices about identity and loyalty. In this complex world, prophetic literature flourishes. Books like Daniel and Enoch capture the imagination of a people looking for signs of divine intervention. They speak of kingdoms rising and falling, of beasts with terrible teeth, of a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Dreams and visions multiply in times of stress. Ordinary people report encounters with angels. Farmers find themselves speaking in tongues. Merchants abandon their shops to follow wandering preachers. The boundary between heaven and earth seems thinner than usual. This is the world that shapes Judas Iscariot, a world where politics and religion interweave like threads in a tapestry, where hope and despair dance together like partners who know their steps by heart, where the cry for a Messiah grows louder with each passing year. The stage is set. The actors are taking their positions, and somewhere in the wings, a young man named Judas prepares to step into the spotlight of history. Judas the man. The hills of Judah roll like sleeping giants beneath the Mediterranean sun. Somewhere among these ancient stones, a child named Judas draws his first breath. His parents, whose names history has forgotten, look down at their son with the same mixture of hope and worry that has marked new parents since the beginning of time. The surname Iscariot clings to him like a shadow. Some scholars trace it to Kerioth, a town that sits in the heart of Judah like a jewel set in weathered stone. Others whisper darker possibilities. The Sicarii, those urban warriors who carry curved daggers beneath their cloaks, claim young men from families touched by loss and anger. If Judas comes from Kerioth, he grows up in a place where stories matter more than comfort. The town perches on a hill overlooking trade routes that have carried caravans since Solomon's time. Here, merchants from distant lands stop to rest and resupply. Their tales of far-off places mix with local legends in the evening air. His father might be a farmer, hands made rough by olive branches and grapevines. The soil of Judah yields its treasures reluctantly. Each harvest requires patience and prayer in equal measure. Young Judas learns early that the earth gives nothing without struggle. This lesson shapes his understanding of how the world works, or perhaps his father works with his hands in different ways. A carpenter, like the teacher from Nazareth whom Judas will later follow. A potter, shaping clay into vessels that will carry water and wine to tables throughout the region. A metalworker, forging tools that will outlast the hands that wield them. The boy's mother teaches him the songs of Israel. Her voice carries melodies that have comforted Jewish children for generations. She tells him stories of brave kings and faithful prophets. Her hands guide his fingers as he learns to form the letters of the ancient tongue. Through her, he inherits the hopes and dreams of his people. The synagogue becomes young Judas's second home. Here, beneath simple wooden beams, he learns to read the sacred scrolls. The words of Moses flow through his mind like water through a dry riverbed. The Psalms of David echo in his heart. The prophecies of Isaiah plant seeds that will grow into expectations. His teachers recognize something special in the boy. Perhaps it is the way he grasps complex ideas. Perhaps it is the intensity of his questions. Perhaps it is simply the hunger in his eyes when the scriptures speak of deliverance and restoration. Whatever the reason, they invest extra time in his education. The festivals of Israel mark the rhythm of Judas's childhood. Passover brings the family to Jerusalem, where they join thousands of other pilgrims in remembering liberation from Egypt. The boy's eyes widen at the sight of the temple's golden doors. His nostrils fill with the scent of incense and sacrifice. His ears ring with the sound of trumpets and singing. During the harvest celebrations, Judas learns the weight of gratitude. The community gathers to acknowledge God's provision. Children run between the adults, their laughter mixing with prayers of thanksgiving. The young man stores these images in his memory, though he does not yet understand how precious they will become. As Judas grows toward manhood, the political situation in Judea intensifies. Roman taxation grows heavier with each passing year. Local magistrates demand bribes for the simplest services. The gap between rich and poor widens like a crack in a foundation. Young men begin to speak in whispers about resistance and revolution. The boy's personality takes shape during these formative years. He possesses a keen intelligence that cuts through pretense to reach the heart of matters. His questions often make adults uncomfortable. He has little patience for answers that fail to satisfy his deeper longings. This intellectual sharpness will serve him well, but it also sets him apart from his peers. Judas develops a reputation for reliability. When tasks need completion, others turn to him. When money needs counting, they trust his careful attention to detail. When plans need making, they value his ability to see potential problems before they arise. These qualities will eventually make him the treasurer of Jesus' inner circle. But beneath the surface competence, something restless stirs. The young man feels the weight of his people's suffering. He sees the Roman soldiers in their scarlet cloaks. He watches tax collectors grow fat while farmers lose their ancestral lands. He hears the old people weep for the days when Israel stood proud among the nations. The scriptures fuel this restlessness. Every prophecy about the coming kingdom burns like fire in his bones. Every promise of restoration seems to mock the present reality. Young Judas begins to wonder why God delays. Why does the Almighty allow his chosen people to suffer under foreign rule? His family's financial situation shapes his worldview in subtle but important ways. Perhaps they struggle to make ends meet, teaching him the value of every coin. Perhaps they achieve modest prosperity, giving him a glimpse of what comfort looks like. Either way, money becomes something he understands in practical terms, rather than abstract principles. The community around Judas buzzes with messianic speculation. Traveling preachers arrive with new interpretations of ancient prophecies. Wonder workers claim to demonstrate divine power. Political rebels recruit followers with promises of liberation. The young man watches these movements with growing fascination. His religious education continues beyond childhood. The local rabbi takes special interest in his progress. Advanced students gather in the teacher's home to wrestle with difficult passages. They debate the meaning of prophecy and the nature of divine justice. These discussions sharpen Judas's theological understanding while deepening his questions. The transition from boyhood to manhood brings new responsibilities. Judas must choose a path for his life. Will he follow his father's trade? Will he pursue religious studies? Will he seek his fortune in the wider world? Each option carries its own risks and rewards. The young man's character solidifies during these crucial years. He develops a fierce loyalty to those he trusts. He demonstrates courage in the face of adversity. He shows compassion for those who suffer. Yet he also exhibits impatience with weakness and frustration with compromise. As Judas approaches full adulthood, the stage is set for his encounter with destiny. The political situation in Palestine continues to deteriorate. Religious expectations continue to rise. The gap between hope and reality continues to widen. Into this volatile mixture will step a teacher from Nazareth, and young Judas Iscariot will face the choice that will define his place in history. The boy who once played in the hills of Judah has become a man carrying the dreams and disappointments of his generation. He stands at the crossroads of his personal story, ready to take the next step toward a garden where his name will echo through eternity. Meeting the rabbi from Nazareth. The morning sun catches the dust kicked up by sandaled feet on the road to Capernaum. News travels faster than the travelers themselves in this corner of Galilee. Word spreads from village to village like ripples on the surface of the great lake. A new teacher has appeared, a rabbi who speaks with authority unlike the scribes and Pharisees. Judas Iscariot hears the whispers in the marketplace. A carpenter's son from Nazareth has begun gathering followers. The man performs wonders that defy explanation. He teaches in parables that stick in the mind like burrs on a traveler's cloak. Some say he might be the promised one, the Messiah who will restore the kingdom to Israel. The young man from Iscariot feels his pulse quicken. He has waited for this moment, though he could not have named what he was waiting for. The scriptures have prepared him. The prayers of his childhood have shaped his expectations. Now possibility walks the roads of Galilee in human form. Perhaps Judas first encounters Jesus at the synagogue in Capernaum. The teacher stands to read from the scroll of Isaiah. His voice carries the ancient words with fresh power. The congregation stirs as familiar prophecies take on new meaning. Eyes widen as the carpenter's son sits down and declares that the scripture has been fulfilled in their hearing. Or maybe the meeting happens beside the lake, where fishermen are mending their nets. Jesus walks along the shore, calling ordinary men to follow him. Simon and Andrew drop their nets without hesitation. James and John leave their father Zebedee sitting in the boat. Something in the teacher's presence makes immediate obedience feel like the only reasonable response. Judas watches these scenes unfold with growing fascination. This Jesus does not look like the conquering king the prophets describe. He wears simple clothes and speaks with a Galilean accent. His hands bear the calluses of honest work, yet authority radiates from him like heat from a fire. When he speaks, even the wind seems to listen. The first miracle Judas witnesses shakes his understanding of what is possible. Perhaps it is the healing of a leper, skin made clean with a touch. Perhaps it is the casting out of a demon, a tormented man restored to sanity with a word. Perhaps it is something even more dramatic, a paralyzed man walking home carrying his own stretcher. Whatever the sign, it confirms what Judas has begun to suspect. This teacher from Nazareth operates with divine authority. The power of God flows through him like water through a channel. The kingdom of heaven has drawn near in his person. The time of fulfillment has arrived. The decision to follow Jesus crystallizes gradually, then suddenly. Judas finds himself drawn to the teacher's presence. The man's words answer questions the young man has carried for years. The vision of the kingdom Jesus presents aligns with everything Judas has hoped for. Here, finally, is someone who can lead Israel to freedom. The call comes like a sunrise, gradual then blinding. Jesus looks at Judas with eyes that seem to see beneath the surface of things. The teacher's voice speaks his name, though they have never been properly introduced. The invitation is simple and profound. Follow me. Judas does not hesitate. He cannot hesitate. The moment feels like destiny unfolding according to an ancient plan. He rises from whatever he was doing and falls into step behind the rabbi from Nazareth. The old life ends. The new life begins. The journey toward Calvary starts with a single step. The early days of discipleship intoxicate Judas with possibility. He joins a band of men who believe they are part of something unprecedented. They have front row seats to the inauguration of God's kingdom. They witness miracles that will be remembered for generations. They hear teachings that will reshape human understanding of divine love. Jesus treats his followers like family. He shares his food with them, his wisdom with them, his mission with them. The disciples discover that following the Messiah means more than they expected. It means belonging to something larger than themselves. It means participating in the restoration of all things. But even in these early days, Judas notices things that puzzle him. Jesus shows mercy to Roman soldiers. He dines with tax collectors and sinners. He speaks of loving enemies and turning the other cheek. The kingdom he proclaims does not match the kingdom most Jews expect. The teacher's parables reveal as much as they conceal. Stories about seeds and soil, about lost sheep and prodigal sons, about workers in a vineyard and talents buried in the ground. Each tale contains layers of meaning that unfold slowly, like flowers opening to the sun. Judas finds himself both enlightened and confused by these verbal puzzles. The crowds that gather around Jesus grow larger with each passing day. Sick people arrive from distant villages. Curious observers come to investigate the rumors. Religious leaders appear to test the teacher's orthodoxy. The movement gains momentum like a stone rolling down a hill. Yet Jesus seems strangely ambivalent about his popularity. He often withdraws from the crowds to pray alone. He warns people not to spread news of his miracles. He speaks mysteriously about his ultimate destination, using phrases that chill the disciples' hearts. The teacher they follow carries secrets that even his closest friends cannot fathom. Judas begins to understand that following Jesus means more than witnessing wonders. It means embracing a way of life that turns conventional wisdom upside down. The first shall be last. The meek shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who mourn. The kingdom of God belongs to children and outcasts and broken people. The intellectual challenge of Jesus' teaching captivates Judas. Here is a mind that can match wits with the most learned scribes. Here is a heart that can touch the deepest human longings. Here is a spirit that seems to commune directly with the divine. The young man from Iscariot feels privileged to walk in such company. As the days turn to weeks and the weeks to months, Judas settles into the rhythm of itinerant ministry. The disciples move from town to town, synagogue to synagogue, hillside to hillside. They sleep under stars and eat what supporters provide. They learn to depend on divine provision and human kindness. The teacher begins to entrust greater responsibilities to his followers. He sends them out in pairs to preach and heal. He shares deeper truths with them in private moments. He prepares them for a mission that will outlast his earthly presence. The disciples sense that they are being equipped for something momentous. Yet, questions multiply along with blessings. Why does Jesus refuse to claim the throne that is rightfully his? Why does he speak so often about suffering and death? Why does he seem to court conflict with the religious authorities? The pieces of the puzzle do not fit together in ways that make sense to human logic. Judas finds himself appointed as the group's treasurer. The responsibility reflects the others' trust in his competence and integrity. He carries the money bag and manages the practical details of their shared life. The position gives him influence and authority within the inner circle, but it also gives him a unique perspective on the contradictions at the heart of Jesus' mission. The teacher who speaks of storing up treasures in heaven still needs earthly resources for daily survival. The man who will eventually be hailed as king currently depends on the generosity of followers who have little to spare. The months pass like chapters in an unfolding story. Judas witnesses more miracles than he can count. He hears more teachings than he can fully comprehend. He participates in a movement that seems destined to change the world. Yet doubts begin to gnaw at the edges of his faith like termites in the foundation of a house. The rabbi from Nazareth has captured Judas's imagination and loyalty. The journey they have begun together will take them to places neither can fully foresee. The road ahead winds through triumph and tragedy, through hosannas and crucifixion, through hope and despair. For now, though, Judas walks in the light of his teacher's presence. The future remains unwritten. The choices that will define his legacy still lie ahead. The young man who answered Jesus' call with such enthusiasm cannot imagine the garden that waits at the end of their journey together. The inner circle. Life as a disciple. The morning air carries the scent of bread baking in distant ovens. 12 men gather around their teacher beside the lake of Galilee. The water laps gently against the shore, keeping time like a heartbeat. This circle of friends has become Judas's world, his family, his home. Life as one of the 12 means learning to live without walls. The disciples sleep wherever darkness finds them. Sometimes they rest in the homes of supporters. Sometimes they spread their cloaks on hillsides under a canopy of stars. Sometimes they find shelter in caves that shepherds have used for centuries. The teacher sets the rhythm of their days. He rises before dawn to pray alone, often slipping away while his followers still sleep. When they wake, they find him already deep in conversation with his Father. His face glows with the afterglow of divine communion. His eyes hold secrets that touch the edge of eternity. Jesus gathers them for the morning teaching. His words flow like water from a spring, clear and life-giving. He speaks of the kingdom in language that children can understand, yet his parables carry depths that scholars cannot fathom. The disciples lean forward, hungry for every syllable that falls from his lips. The lessons happen everywhere. A field of wheat becomes a classroom for teaching about harvest. A vine heavy with grapes illustrates the connection between branches and life. A sparrow falling from a tree demonstrates the Father's care for the smallest creatures. Creation itself serves as the teacher's textbook. Judas watches Jesus transform ordinary moments into sacred encounters. A conversation with a Samaritan woman at a well becomes a discourse on living water. A meal with tax collectors becomes a lesson about the joy of redemption. A walk through a graveyard becomes a demonstration of resurrection power. The miracles become part of their daily experience. The disciples grow accustomed to impossible things. Sick people approach Jesus with desperate faith and leave with renewed bodies. Demons flee at the sound of his voice. Natural forces bend to his will like servants eager to please their master. Yet the teacher remains remarkably human. He grows tired after long days of ministry. He feels hunger and thirst like any other man. He experiences joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. The divine nature that dwells within him never overshadows his genuine humanity. The 12 develop their own dynamics and relationships. Peter emerges as the unofficial spokesman, quick to speak and slow to think. James and John earn the nickname Sons of Thunder for their fiery temperaments. Matthew brings the precision of a tax collector to their shared life. Thomas asks the questions others are afraid to voice. Judas finds his place within this brotherhood. His intelligence wins respect. His practical skills prove invaluable. His ability to manage money makes him the natural choice for treasurer. The common purse becomes his responsibility, a trust that reflects the other's confidence in his character. The money bag carries more than coins. It holds the offerings of supporters who believe in their mission. Widows' mites rest beside donations from wealthy benefactors. The purse represents the intersection of heavenly calling and earthly necessity. Managing it requires both practical wisdom and spiritual discernment. Jesus teaches them to pray with words that will echo through centuries. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. The disciples learn to approach the Creator of the universe with the intimacy of children. They discover that prayer is less about changing God's mind and more about aligning their hearts with His purposes. The teacher's parables become conversation starters that last for hours. What does it mean to be a good Samaritan? How do we recognize the kingdom of God? Why does the narrow gate lead to life? The disciples wrestle with these questions as they walk from village to village, their understanding deepening with each discussion. Meals together create some of their most precious memories. Jesus has a way of making ordinary food extraordinary. He blesses their simple provisions with gratitude that transforms scarcity into abundance. The disciples learn that sharing multiplies rather than divides. Breaking bread together becomes a sacrament of fellowship. The teacher's compassion for people amazes his followers. He never seems to grow tired of human need. Lepers find cleansing in his presence. Blind men receive sight. Deaf ears open to the sound of his voice. The disciples witness love in action, day after day, miracle after miracle. Yet Jesus also challenges them with hard sayings. He speaks of taking up crosses and losing life to find it. He talks about leaving everything behind to follow him. He warns that his path leads through suffering to glory. The disciples struggle to reconcile these difficult teachings with their expectations of triumph. The religious authorities begin to take notice of their movement. Pharisees appear at the edges of crowds, taking notes and asking pointed questions. Scribes challenge Jesus' interpretations of Scripture. The tension builds like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Jesus prepares his disciples for greater responsibility. He sends them out in pairs to preach and heal. They return with stories of demons submitting to them and sick people being made whole. The teacher smiles at their excitement while warning them to rejoice more in their heavenly citizenship than in their earthly success. The inner circle witnesses moments of divine revelation that will sustain them through dark days ahead. On a high mountain, Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John. His face shines like the sun. His clothes become white as light. Moses and Elijah appear to discuss his approaching departure. Judas treasures these experiences, though he cannot fully understand their significance. He sees Jesus walking on water as if the lake were solid ground. He watches 5 loaves and 2 fish feed thousands of people. He hears the teacher's voice calm storms with the authority of one who spoke the worlds into existence. The disciples learn to depend on supernatural provision. Their needs are met through the generosity of supporters and the creative power of their teacher. They discover that seeking first the kingdom of God does indeed result in having all other things added to them. The teacher's love for his followers becomes evident in countless small ways. He notices when they are tired and provides rest. He sees their confusion and offers clarity. He observes their fears and speaks peace. The disciples experience grace in practical form, day after day, hour after hour. But questions begin to multiply alongside blessings. Why does Jesus seem to avoid opportunities for political advancement? Why does he speak so often about going to Jerusalem to suffer? Why does he warn them about betrayal and abandonment? The pieces of the puzzle refuse to arrange themselves in satisfying patterns. Judas finds himself torn between loyalty and doubt. He loves the teacher with the devotion of a son. He believes in the mission with the passion of a patriot. Yet he struggles to understand why Jesus seems to be leading them toward disaster rather than triumph. The other disciples share his confusion, though they express it differently. They argue about who will be greatest in the kingdom. They suggest calling down fire on inhospitable villages. They try to prevent children from approaching Jesus. Their humanity shows through the cracks of their faith. The teacher's patience with their weaknesses encourages Judas. Jesus never abandons them despite their failures. He continues to invest in their growth despite their misunderstandings. He keeps loving them despite their limitations. This grace gives the treasurer hope that his own doubts will not disqualify him from belonging. The rhythm of their shared life creates bonds deeper than blood. They have walked thousands of miles together. They have shared countless meals. They have witnessed wonders that will fuel their testimonies for the rest of their lives. The 12 have become brothers in the truest sense of the word. Yet even within this tight-knit group, Judas sometimes feels isolated. His questions run deeper than the others. His expectations clash more sharply with reality. His disappointments cut more severely than theirs. The treasurer begins to wonder if he understands something his companions have missed, or if he has misunderstood everything from the beginning. The teacher continues to love them all, including the one who will betray him. Jesus' eyes hold compassion even for Judas, though they also hold sorrow. The rabbi from Nazareth knows what is coming. He sees the end from the beginning. Yet he continues to pour himself into these imperfect men who will carry his message to the world. The inner circle stands at the center of the greatest story ever told. They have been chosen to witness the incarnation of divine love. They have been commissioned to announce the arrival of God's kingdom. They have been trusted with the gospel that will transform human history. For now, they continue their journey together, unaware that their time is growing short. The road ahead leads to Jerusalem, to the upper room, to the garden, where friendship will fracture and love will be tested. But in this moment, they are simply 12 men following the teacher who has captured their hearts and called them to something greater than themselves. Ambition and disillusionment. The morning sun casts long shadows across the Judean hills as Judas walks behind his teacher, the money bag heavy on his shoulder. Months have passed since he first answered Jesus' call, and the weight he carries now extends beyond coins and donations. Questions multiply in his mind like seeds scattered by the wind. When Judas first joined the 12, his heart burned with revolutionary fire. He envisioned Jesus claiming the throne of David, driving out the Roman occupiers, and restoring Israel to its former glory. The prophecies seemed clear. The Messiah would be a conquering king, mighty in battle, terrible to his enemies. The teacher's miracles had confirmed these expectations. A man who could calm storms surely possessed the power to topple governments. A man who could feed thousands with a boy's lunch clearly had the resources to supply an army. A man who could raise the dead certainly had the authority to establish a kingdom that would last forever. But as the months unfold, Jesus' actions confuse rather than clarify. He refuses opportunities for political advancement. When the crowds want to make him king by force, he withdraws to pray alone. When zealots offer their services, he speaks instead of loving enemies and turning the other cheek. The teacher's parables add to Judas's perplexity. Stories about mustard seeds and hidden treasure, about lost sheep and prodigal sons, about workers in a vineyard who receive equal pay despite unequal labor. These tales speak of a kingdom that operates by different rules than earthly governments. Grace trumps merit. Mercy overcomes justice. The last become first. Judas tries to reconcile these teachings with his understanding of Scripture. The prophets spoke of a Messiah who would break the rod of the oppressor and establish justice in the earth. They described a king who would make war no more and whose government would increase without end. How do Jesus' gentle parables fit with these powerful prophecies? The treasurer's practical mind grapples with contradictions that others seem content to ignore. Jesus speaks of storing up treasures in heaven while depending on earthly donations for survival. He preaches about not worrying for tomorrow while carefully planning their travel routes. He teaches about divine provision while rationing their limited resources. The money bag becomes a symbol of these tensions. Judas counts the coins each evening, calculating whether they have enough for the next day's needs. The weight of financial responsibility sits uneasily with teachings about trusting God for daily bread. How can they build a movement without proper funding? How can they challenge an empire while living as wandering paupers? Supporters approach Jesus with offers of wealth and influence. Rich young rulers seek to join the movement. Wealthy women provide from their resources. Yet the teacher consistently redirects these opportunities away from material gain towards spiritual transformation. Judas watches potential advantages slip away like water through open fingers. The religious establishment's opposition grows more organized and dangerous. Pharisees shadow their movements, documenting every unconventional teaching. Scribes challenge Jesus' authority with increasingly hostile questions. The Sanhedrin begins to view the movement as a threat requiring elimination rather than mere monitoring. Meanwhile, Roman authorities maintain their watchful presence. Soldiers patrol the roads. Tax collectors extract their tribute. Governors rule with iron fists wrapped in silk gloves. The machinery of empire grinds on, apparently unaffected by the teacher's proclamation that God's kingdom has drawn near. Judas observes these realities with growing frustration. The powers that oppress his people seem stronger than ever. The systems that perpetuate injustice continue unchanged. The revolution he expected has become a spiritual movement that appears to ignore political realities. The other disciples share some of his concerns, though they express them differently. James and John ask for positions of honor in the coming kingdom. Peter declares his willingness to fight and die for Jesus. Simon the Zealot brings contacts from the resistance movement. The group's expectations align more with conventional messianic hopes than with their teacher's mysterious agenda. Jesus' responses to these ambitions consistently disappoint. He speaks of greatness through service rather than dominance. He describes leadership as washing feet rather than commanding armies. He promises his followers suffering rather than glory, crosses rather than crowns. The teacher's predictions about his own future particularly disturb Judas. Jesus speaks repeatedly of going to Jerusalem to be rejected by the elders, condemned by the chief priests, and handed over to the Gentiles. He describes his death in graphic detail, mentioning crucifixion as if it were inevitable rather than preventable. These prophecies strike Judas as defeatist and unnecessary. Why accept martyrdom when victory remains possible? Why surrender to enemies when allies stand ready to fight? Why choose the path of greatest resistance when strategic compromise might achieve better results? The treasurer begins to wonder if his teacher lacks the political wisdom necessary for effective leadership. Jesus' refusal to court influential supporters puzzles him. The rabbi's tendency to antagonize religious authorities seems counterproductive. His willingness to associate with tax collectors and sinners alienates potential allies from respectable society. Judas's intellectual honesty forces him to confront uncomfortable questions. Perhaps he misunderstood Jesus' mission from the beginning. Perhaps the kingdom the teacher proclaims differs fundamentally from the kingdom Judas expected. Perhaps following Jesus means abandoning his deepest hopes for Israel's liberation. The weight of these realizations settles on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The revolutionary fervor that once energized him begins to cool. The messianic expectations that once inspired him start to crumble. The future he once anticipated begins to fade like morning mist in the rising sun. Yet Judas cannot simply walk away. Too much connects him to this teacher and this movement. He has invested too much time, too much energy, too much hope to abandon everything now. The bonds of fellowship hold him even as doubt gnaws at his confidence. The treasurer finds himself caught between worlds. His heart still loves the teacher who called him to follow. His mind increasingly questions the wisdom of that call. His spirit yearns for the kingdom Jesus proclaims, while his soul grieves for the kingdom that seems to be slipping away. Money begins to take on greater significance in Judas's thinking. The coins in his bag represent security in an uncertain world. They provide options when everything else seems to be narrowing toward an inevitable conclusion. They offer practical solutions to problems that spiritual answers cannot address. The treasurer notices how little his teacher seems to understand about financial realities. Jesus gives away their resources with casual generosity. He refuses profitable opportunities without apparent regret. He trusts in divine provision while ignoring obvious economic principles. This perceived naivety frustrates Judas more than he cares to admit. How can someone so wise about spiritual matters be so foolish about practical concerns? How can someone who claims divine authority be so helpless in earthly affairs? How can someone who promises to establish a kingdom be so unprepared for the costs of revolution? The gap between expectation and reality continues to widen. Judas watches other would-be messiahs gather larger crowds and attract more influential supporters. He observes how political movements gain momentum through strategic alliances and careful planning. He compares these examples with Jesus' seemingly random wanderings and spontaneous teachings. The treasurer's loyalty begins to war with his judgment. Love for his teacher conflicts with doubt about his methods. Commitment to the cause clashes with questions about its direction. The man who once followed without hesitation now finds himself walking with increasingly heavy steps. Yet Jesus continues to demonstrate power that defies human limitation. Miracles punctuate their journey like exclamation points in divine script. The teacher's words carry authority that silences opposition and transforms hearts. His presence radiates love that melts the hardest resistance. These manifestations of divine power keep Judas from complete despair. Perhaps his teacher operates according to wisdom too deep for human understanding. Perhaps the kingdom will come in ways too wonderful for finite minds to anticipate. Perhaps his doubts reflect limitation rather than insight. The tension between hope and disappointment defines Judas's internal landscape. He walks toward Jerusalem carrying more than money in his bag. He bears the weight of unfulfilled expectations, unanswered questions, and unresolved conflicts between what he hoped for and what he has found. The road ahead stretches like a question mark written in dust and stone. The treasurer does not know what awaits in the holy city. He cannot foresee the choices that will soon confront him. He can only continue walking, one step at a time, toward whatever destiny waits at journey's end. The road to Jerusalem. Spring touches the hills of Judea with gentle fingers, coaxing wild flowers from the rocky soil. The festival of Passover approaches, drawing pilgrims from every corner of the known world toward the holy city. Among the travelers walking the ancient roads, 13 men make their way toward a destiny none of them fully comprehends. Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem with the determination of a man keeping an appointment with eternity. His steps carry purpose that his followers feel but cannot name. The teacher who once wandered freely through Galilee now moves with singular focus toward the city of David. The disciples sense a change in their master's demeanor. The easy joy that once characterized his ministry has given way to something deeper and more somber. He speaks more frequently of suffering and death. His prayers grow longer and more intense. His eyes hold shadows that worry those who love him. Judas walks among the 12, the money bag bouncing against his hip with each step. The coins inside represent their modest resources, carefully managed and strategically deployed. As treasurer, he thinks constantly about practical matters. Where will they stay in Jerusalem? How will they afford Passover preparations? What will happen to their mission if the religious authorities act against them? The teacher's recent actions have escalated tensions with the Sanhedrin. His cleansing of the temple courtyard created enemies among the merchant class. His debates with Pharisees and Sadducees have grown more pointed and public. His growing popularity threatens the delicate balance the religious leaders maintain with Roman authorities. Word reaches them on the road that the chief priests have issued warrants for Jesus' arrest. The Sanhedrin has declared him a dangerous revolutionary whose teachings threaten public order. Bounties have been placed on information about his whereabouts. The net is closing around their small band of followers. These developments force Judas to confront the trajectory of their movement. The teacher he followed with such hope now appears to be leading them towards certain destruction. The kingdom they expected to establish seems further away than ever. The revolution they thought they were joining has become a march toward martyrdom. The treasurer's mind races with alternative scenarios. Perhaps Jesus intends to force a confrontation that will rally the people to his cause. Perhaps he plans to demonstrate divine power in ways that will compel recognition from the authorities. Perhaps he knows something about the Father's plans that he has not shared with his followers. But these hopeful possibilities clash with the teacher's increasingly explicit predictions. Jesus speaks openly of being betrayed by one of his own disciples. He describes his coming death in graphic detail. He warns that his followers will scatter when crisis comes. These prophecies sound more like statements of fact than expressions of fear. The other disciples react to these predictions with varying degrees of denial and confusion. Peter declares his willingness to die before allowing harm to come to his master. James and John assert their readiness to drink from whatever cup Jesus must drain. Thomas speaks for many when he says, "Let us go and die with him." Their loyalty touches Jesus deeply, yet he knows their protestations exceed their understanding. When the moment of testing comes, good intentions will not prove sufficient. Human weakness will triumph over spiritual determination. Love will yield to fear when the stakes become clear. Judas listens to these exchanges with growing internal conflict. Part of him admires the other disciples' devotion. Part of him questions their naivety. Part of him wonders if he alone sees the disaster approaching with frightening clarity. The treasurer's relationship with money begins to shift during this period. The coins in his bag no longer represent just operational expenses. They become symbols of security in an increasingly uncertain world. They offer options that loyalty alone cannot provide. Jerusalem grows larger on the horizon with each passing day. The city walls catch the afternoon sun like a crown of white stone. Pilgrims flood the roads from every direction, their voices raised in songs of ascent. The atmosphere crackles with religious excitement and political tension. Jesus' teaching during this final journey takes on greater urgency and specificity. He speaks of the kingdom's coming in terms that suggest both triumph and tragedy. He describes a Son of Man who will be lifted up to draw all people to himself. He warns of judgment that will separate the faithful from the false. The parables become darker and more pointed. Stories about wedding banquets where invited guests refuse to come. Tales of servants who abuse their master's property while he travels. Warnings about wise and foolish bridesmaids who wait for a bridegroom's return. Each story carries weight that presses on the disciples' hearts. Judas finds himself particularly affected by Jesus' parable about talents entrusted to servants. The story troubles him with its implications about accountability and stewardship. What has he done with the opportunities his teacher has given him? How will he account for the trust placed in his hands? The crowds gathering around Jesus grow larger and more diverse. Zealots mingle with Pharisees. Roman sympathizers walk beside Jewish nationalists. The poor and desperate press close to the teacher, hoping for healing or blessing. The wealthy and powerful observe from safe distances, calculating risks and opportunities. This volatile mixture of expectations and agendas creates an atmosphere ripe for misunderstanding and conflict. Different groups project their own hopes onto Jesus, seeing in him the fulfillment of their particular dreams. Few understand that his mission transcends their categories and expectations. The religious authorities' surveillance becomes more obvious and intrusive. Spies follow the group at safe distances, taking notes on everything Jesus says and does. Temple guards appear at the edges of crowds, ready to act if given the signal. The noose of official opposition tightens with each passing day. Roman soldiers maintain their presence with professional efficiency. They understand that Passover always brings the risk of nationalist uprisings. Any disturbance that threatens public order will be crushed with overwhelming force. The peace they enforce is the peace of the grave, silent and still. Judas observes these political realities with the clear eyes of a man trained to handle practical matters. The mathematics of revolution do not favor their small band of followers. The odds against success grow longer with each new enemy they acquire. The teacher's refusal to build strategic alliances appears increasingly foolish, yet miracles continue to punctuate their journey. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the deaf hear. News of these wonders spreads faster than the travelers themselves, drawing ever larger crowds to witness the teacher's power. Divine authority manifests itself despite human opposition. These demonstrations of supernatural ability give Judas momentary hope that perhaps his fears are unfounded. Perhaps Jesus possesses resources beyond human calculation. Perhaps the Father will intervene to protect his anointed one. Perhaps the kingdom will come through divine power rather than human planning. But these hopes fade when he sees the teacher's continued vulnerability to arrest, trial, and execution. If Jesus can heal the sick and raise the dead, why can he not protect himself from his enemies? If he possesses divine authority, why does he submit to human opposition? If he truly is the Son of God, why does he walk so willingly towards suffering? The final approach to Jerusalem intensifies every emotion and sharpens every question. The holy city rises before them like a fortress built of stone and prayer. Within its walls wait the temple where God's presence dwells, the Sanhedrin that governs Jewish life, and the Roman fortress that guarantees imperial control. Jesus looks upon the city with tears streaming down his face. He weeps for its beauty and its blindness, its holiness and its hardness. He sees what could have been and what must now come to pass. His heart breaks for the people who will reject their moment of visitation. The disciples watch their teacher's emotional display with confusion and concern. Why does approaching Jerusalem bring sorrow rather than joy? Why does the sight of the holy city provoke tears rather than celebration? Why does their triumphant entry feel more like a funeral procession than a victory parade? Judas feels the weight of impending decision pressing down upon him like a physical burden. The road they travel leads to a crossroads where he must choose between competing loyalties. The teacher he loves appears determined to destroy himself and his mission. The cause he believed in seems destined for failure. The treasurer's hand moves unconsciously to the money bag at his side. The coins within represent more than operational funds now. They symbolize alternatives to martyrdom, options beyond suicide, paths away from the disaster his teacher seems determined to embrace. The sun sets behind them as they make their final approach to Jerusalem. Tomorrow they will enter the city amid crowds crying, "Hosanna!" Within a week, those same crowds will demand crucifixion. The treasurer cannot see this future clearly, but he senses the approaching storm with the instinct of a man trained to count costs and calculate risks. The road they travel has become a path between worlds. Behind them lies the certainty of their Galilean ministry. Ahead waits the uncertainty of their Jerusalem destiny. Judas walks between these realities, carrying coins that will soon become instruments of betrayal and a heart that will soon break beneath the weight of impossible choices. Palm Sunday to temple cleansing. The morning sun rises over Jerusalem like a golden trumpet announcing the arrival of festival season. Passover draws near and the holy city swells with pilgrims from every corner of the Jewish world. The air thrums with anticipation and prayer, languages and dialects mixing like colors on an artist's palette. Jesus and his disciples approach the Mount of Olives, that ancient hill overlooking the temple's gleaming walls. The teacher pauses in his journey, his eyes scanning the crowds below. Something momentous stirs in the spiritual atmosphere. Heaven and earth prepare to intersect in ways that will echo through eternity. The teacher sends two disciples ahead with specific instructions. They will find a young donkey tied near the village entrance. When questioned about taking it, they should simply say, "The Lord needs it." The animal will be brought without resistance, as if destiny itself arranges the details. Judas watches these preparations with the eyes of a man accustomed to managing practical affairs. The symbolism strikes him immediately. Zechariah's prophecy speaks of a king coming to Jerusalem, humble and riding on a donkey. The teacher seems determined to fulfill this ancient promise in the most public way possible. The disciples return with the donkey as predicted. They spread their cloaks across its back, creating a makeshift saddle for their master. Jesus mounts the animal with the dignity of a king claiming his throne. The procession begins its descent toward the city below. Word of their approach spreads through the pilgrim camps like fire through dry grass. Crowds gather along the roadside, drawn by rumors of the miracle worker from Galilee. Children run ahead, their voices bright with excitement. Adults follow more cautiously, uncertain what to expect from this unusual royal procession. The cries begin spontaneously, bursting from hearts long trained to hope for deliverance. Hosanna to the Son of David. The ancient words carry centuries of messianic longing. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The people recognize something significant happening, though they cannot fully grasp its meaning. Palm branches appear as if conjured from the air. Pilgrims cut fronds from nearby trees and wave them like banners of victory. Others spread their cloaks on the road before the donkey's feet, creating a royal carpet of ordinary fabric. The spontaneous coronation unfolds with the power of prophecy fulfilling itself. Judas finds himself swept along in the crowd's enthusiasm despite his growing reservations about the teacher's methods. The popular acclaim feels intoxicating after months of increasing opposition from religious authorities. Perhaps this demonstration of public support will force a recalculation of political possibilities. The treasurer's practical mind analyzes the crowd's composition. Galilean pilgrims predominate, people who have heard stories of Jesus' miracles and teachings. Jerusalem natives remain more cautious, watching from doorways and rooftops. The religious establishment is notably absent from the celebration. Jesus rides through the adulation with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance. He knows what these crowds expect from their acclaimed Messiah. They want liberation from Roman oppression. They desire restoration of political independence. They dream of Israel's return to glory among the nations. But the kingdom he brings operates by different principles than earthly governments. His crown will be made of thorns rather than gold. His throne will be a cross rather than ivory. His victory will come through death rather than conquest. The gap between expectation and reality yawns like a chasm. The procession reaches the Temple Mount as the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the courtyard. The sacred precincts bustle with commercial activity that has grown up around the sacrificial system. Money changers conduct business beneath colonnades built for prayer. Merchants sell doves and sheep to pilgrims needing offerings. Jesus surveys this scene with eyes that burn with righteous anger. The house of prayer has become a marketplace. The dwelling place of the Most High has been turned into a den of thieves. The sacred has been subordinated to the commercial in ways that mock the very purpose of worship. What happens next shocks even the disciples who thought they knew their teacher well. Jesus begins overturning the tables of money changers with violent force. Coins scatter across the stone floor like metallic rain. Merchants flee as their carefully arranged wares crash to the ground. The teacher's voice rings across the courtyard with prophetic authority. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. His words echo off the temple walls like thunder from a clear sky. The crowd falls silent, awed by the display of divine anger. Judas watches these events unfold with growing alarm. The treasurer in him winces at the financial loss represented by the overturned tables. The practical politician in him recognizes the bridge-burning nature of this confrontation. The loyal disciple in him admires his teacher's courage while questioning his wisdom. The temple authorities respond with predictable outrage. Chief priests and scribes push through the crowd, their faces dark with anger. How dare this Galilean peasant challenge their authority in the sacred precincts? How dare he disrupt the orderly commerce that supports the sacrificial system? But they cannot act immediately. The crowd's sympathy clearly lies with Jesus. Any attempt to arrest him now would risk a riot that might draw Roman intervention. The authorities must content themselves with taking notes and planning their response for a more opportune moment. The cleansing creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the temple courtyard. Merchants who depend on temple commerce find their livelihoods threatened. Religious leaders see their authority challenged. Roman officials receive reports of a disturbance that might indicate brewing rebellion. Jesus continues teaching in the temple courts throughout the week, as if claiming the sacred space for its intended purpose. His words draw crowds of pilgrims hungry for authentic spiritual instruction. Children sing hosannas in the porticos, their innocent voices carrying what adult voices dare not proclaim. The teacher's parables during this period grow sharper and more pointed. He speaks of wicked tenants who reject the vineyard owner's son. He describes a wedding feast where invited guests refuse to come. He warns of stones crying out when human voices fall silent. Each story hits its target with surgical precision. The religious leaders recognize themselves in the unflattering portraits Jesus paints. Their anger grows with each passing day. Plans begin forming in the shadows of sacred halls. The net continues tightening around the teacher and his followers. Judas observes these developments with the clear-eyed analysis of a man trained to manage resources and assess risks. The teacher's actions have eliminated any possibility of peaceful coexistence with the religious establishment. The bridge back to safety has been thoroughly burned. The treasurer's mind calculates the odds facing their small movement. Arrayed against them stand the Sanhedrin with its political connections, the temple guards with their weapons, the Roman authorities with their legions. On their side stand a few dozen disciples and the fickle support of pilgrims who will return to their homes when the festival ends. The mathematics of revolution do not favor their cause. The teacher's refusal to build strategic alliances now appears not just unwise, but suicidal. His determination to confront the establishment directly ensures their destruction. The kingdom they hope to establish seems further away than ever. Yet, miracles continue to flow from Jesus' hands like water from a spring. The blind receive sight in the temple courts, the lame walk through the sacred porticos, the mute sing praises to God. Divine power manifests itself despite human opposition. These demonstrations of supernatural authority give Judas momentary hope that perhaps his fears are unfounded. Perhaps the teacher possesses resources beyond human calculation. Perhaps the Father will intervene to protect his anointed one. Perhaps victory will come through divine power rather than political strategy. But these hopes fade when Judas considers the teacher's continued vulnerability to arrest and execution. If Jesus can heal diseases and cast out demons, why does he remain subject to human threats? If he truly possesses divine authority, why does he not use it to establish his kingdom immediately? The week progresses with mounting tension on all sides. Religious leaders plot in secret chambers. Roman officials monitor the situation for signs of rebellion. Pilgrims enjoy the festival while sensing undercurrents they cannot identify. The disciples remain close to their teacher, uncertain what each new day will bring. Judas finds his loyalty increasingly strained by conflicting emotions. Love for his teacher wars with doubt about his methods. Commitment to the cause clashes with concern for their survival. Hope for the kingdom struggles against fear of destruction. The money bag at his side grows heavier with each passing day, though its contents remain unchanged. The coins within no longer represent just operational expenses. They symbolize options that loyalty alone cannot provide. They offer alternatives to the martyrdom their teacher seems determined to embrace. The Palm Sunday triumph has become a hollow memory within days. The temple cleansing has created enemies who will not forget or forgive. The road ahead leads toward confrontation that only one side can survive. Judas walks this path with growing reluctance, sensing that choices await him that will test the very foundations of his faith. The anointing at Bethany. The evening shadows lengthen across the small village of Bethany, where olive trees stand like ancient sentinels guarding the homes of the faithful. This quiet place, nestled on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, has become a refuge for Jesus and his disciples during these tense final days in Jerusalem. In the house of Simon, whom Jesus once cleansed of leprosy, a dinner unfolds that will echo through eternity. The room fills with the warmth of friendship and the fragrance of simple food shared in love. Martha bustles about serving, her face glowing with the joy of hosting the teacher who has blessed their family beyond measure. Lazarus reclines at the table beside Jesus, his presence a living testimony to the power that flows through the teacher's hands. Not long ago, this man lay wrapped in grave clothes, 4 days dead in the tomb. Now he laughs and speaks and shares the evening meal, resurrection personified in human form. The disciples gather around the low table, their hearts heavy with the events of recent days. The temple cleansing has created powerful enemies. The religious authorities speak openly of arrest and trial. The teacher himself grows more explicit in his predictions of suffering and death. Judas sits among his companions, the money bag resting beside him like a faithful companion. As treasurer, he has grown accustomed to calculating costs and managing resources. His practical mind constantly evaluates their situation, weighing options and considering alternatives to the disaster that seems to approach with inexorable momentum. The conversation flows around the table like gentle water over stones. Jesus speaks of the kingdom with the same passion that has always marked his teaching. The disciples ask questions that reveal both their love and their confusion. The future remains uncertain, but this moment holds the sweetness of fellowship undimmed by coming sorrows. Then Mary appears, carrying an alabaster jar that catches the lamplight like captured starfire. The vessel contains pure nard, a perfume so precious that its value equals a laborer's wages for an entire year. The fragrance alone speaks of sacrifice beyond ordinary understanding. Without hesitation or explanation, Mary breaks the jar at Jesus' feet. The precious oil flows out like liquid worship, its aroma immediately filling the entire house. She kneels beside the teacher, her tears mingling with the costly perfume as she anoints his feet with the devotion of one who has received everything. The scene unfolds in silence, broken only by quiet weeping. Mary's actions speak a language deeper than words. Her sacrifice expresses love that cannot be contained or calculated. Her gesture acknowledges the approaching darkness while celebrating the light that shines within it. But the silence shatters when Judas speaks, his voice sharp with indignation. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? His words carry the ring of practical wisdom and moral concern. Surely such valuable resources could serve better purposes than this extravagant display. The treasurer's objection reflects genuine frustration that has been building for months. He has watched Jesus refuse profitable opportunities and reject strategic alliances. He has seen their teacher give away resources that could have advanced their cause. This latest waste of precious perfume represents everything that troubles him about their mission's direction. Other disciples nod in agreement with Judas's criticism. The amount of money represented by the broken jar could feed many hungry families. It could support their ministry for months. It could purchase supplies and services that would advance the kingdom's work. The extravagance seems both foolish and selfish, but Jesus' response cuts through their practical calculations with the clarity of divine perspective. Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. His words carry gentle authority that transforms criticism into understanding. The teacher continues, his voice thick with emotion. The poor you will always have with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. The statement hangs in the air like a prophecy of approaching separation. Jesus then speaks words that will preserve Mary's action in human memory forever. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. The broken jar becomes a symbol of love that transcends practical limitations. Judas listens to these words with growing discomfort. The teacher's defense of Mary's action challenges his most fundamental assumptions about proper stewardship. How can wasting precious resources be called beautiful? How can extravagance be elevated above efficiency? The treasurer's practical mind struggles to reconcile Jesus' teaching with his actual behavior. The man who speaks of caring for the poor accepts this costly offering without protest. The teacher who preaches about wise stewardship celebrates what appears to be foolish waste. But beneath Judas's stated concern for the poor lies a deeper frustration with his teacher's methods. The broken jar represents everything he finds perplexing about Jesus' approach to ministry. The extravagant gesture symbolizes the impractical idealism that seems to guide their mission. The fragrance of the perfume continues to fill the house, creating an atmosphere of sacred encounter. The broken jar cannot be repaired. The precious oil cannot be recovered. Mary's gift has been given completely, without reservation or possibility of return. This irreversible nature of her sacrifice particularly troubles Judas. The treasurer in him values prudence and careful planning. The practical man in him prefers investments that can be recovered if circumstances change. The cautious disciple in him questions commitments that allow no room for retreat. Yet something in Mary's action also moves him deeply. Her tears speak of love that defies calculation. Her sacrifice demonstrates devotion that transcends practical considerations. Her gesture expresses faith that believes in giving everything to the one who deserves everything. The other disciples begin to understand the symbolic meaning of Mary's action. The anointing oil traditionally marks kings and priests for their sacred duties. By pouring it on Jesus, Mary acknowledges his divine calling and approaching sacrifice. Her gesture becomes an act of coronation and preparation. But Judas finds himself increasingly isolated by his inability to embrace this understanding. While others see beauty in the broken jar, he sees waste. While others find meaning in the extravagant gesture, he finds frustration. While others celebrate the gift, he calculates the loss. The treasurer's criticism reveals more about his own state of mind than about Mary's action. The months of growing disillusionment have created a lens through which he views every event. The gap between his expectations and reality colors his perception of everything his teacher does or allows. The evening continues, but the mood has shifted. Mary's gift has created a dividing line between those who understand love's logic and those who insist on practical reasoning. The disciples find themselves choosing sides in a debate that will echo through the centuries. Jesus speaks tenderly of his approaching departure, using language that both reveals and conceals his meaning. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. The grain of wheat must fall into the earth and die if it is to bear much fruit. The shepherd will be struck and the sheep will scatter. These predictions trouble all the disciples, but they affect Judas most deeply. The treasurer has invested everything in this movement. He has left his former life behind to follow this teacher. The possibility that it might all end in failure and death shakes the foundations of his faith. The perfume's fragrance lingers in the air like a prayer made visible. Mary's broken jar sits as a testament to love that gives without counting the cost. The disciples prepare to leave this place of refuge and return to Jerusalem, where enemies gather like storm clouds on the horizon. Judas shoulders the money bag with its familiar weight of coins and responsibilities. But tonight, the burden feels heavier than usual. The contrast between Mary's extravagant gift and his careful stewardship highlights questions he can no longer ignore. The road back to Jerusalem stretches before them like a path toward destiny. The treasurer walks in silence, his mind churning with calculations that extend beyond financial concerns. The broken jar has shattered more than alabaster. It has broken open questions about love and loyalty, about wisdom and waste, about following a teacher whose ways defy human understanding. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and deeper crises. The religious authorities continue their plotting. The Roman officials maintain their vigilance. The disciples struggle with fears they cannot name. But tonight, the fragrance of sacrificial love fills the air, a reminder that some gifts transcend the logic of earthly accounting. The bargain, 30 pieces of silver. The night air hangs heavy over Jerusalem as Judas Iscariot walks alone through the narrow streets. His footsteps echo off stone walls that have witnessed countless conspiracies throughout the centuries. The money bag bounces against his side, its familiar weight now feeling like an accusation rather than a responsibility. 3 days have passed since the incident at Bethany. The fragrance of Mary's perfume still seems to cling to his clothes. a constant reminder of the confrontation that crystallized his growing doubts. The teacher's defense of such extravagance has shaken something fundamental in Judas's understanding of their mission. The treasurer's mind replays the events with obsessive precision. 300 denarii worth of precious nard poured out like water, enough silver to feed dozens of families for months. Resources that could have advanced their cause squandered in a moment of emotional excess. The waste troubles him more than he can articulate. But deeper than financial concern lies a more troubling realization. The teacher he has followed for 3 years seems determined to court disaster. The temple cleansing has made enemies of the religious establishment. The royal procession on Palm Sunday has attracted unwanted attention from Roman authorities. Every action seems calculated to provoke rather than persuade. Judas finds himself questioning everything he once believed about Jesus' mission. Where is the strategic thinking that building a kingdom requires? Where is the political wisdom necessary to challenge entrenched power? Where is the practical planning that revolution demands? The streets of Jerusalem pulse with festival energy despite the late hour. Pilgrims crowd the narrow passages, their voices raised in songs of celebration. But beneath the surface joy, currents of tension flow like underground rivers. The city holds its breath, waiting for something significant to unfold. The treasurer's destination tonight is not random. He has been thinking, calculating, weighing options with the careful deliberation that has always marked his character. The conclusion he has reached feels both inevitable and impossible. Yet circumstances have conspired to make the unthinkable seem necessary. The house of Caiaphas, the high priest, rises before him like a fortress of power and privilege. Light spills from upper windows where important men conduct the business of governing God's people. Guards stand at the entrance, their presence testament to the dangers that lurk in Jerusalem's shadows. Judas approaches the guards with the determined step of a man who has crossed a river that cannot be recrossed. His voice carries steady authority as he requests an audience with the religious leaders. He has information they will find valuable. He represents an opportunity they cannot afford to ignore. The guards escort him through courtyards that speak of wealth accumulated through centuries of temple administration. Marble columns support roofs that shelter the powerful. Expensive tapestries hang on walls that have heard the secrets of nations. This is where the real decisions affecting Jewish life are made. The chamber where they bring him contains men whose names carry weight throughout Palestine. Caiaphas himself sits at the center of the gathering, his face bearing the careful expression of one who has learned to reveal nothing while seeing everything. Around him cluster the chief priests and elders who form the inner circle of the Sanhedrin. These are the men who have been hunting Jesus since the temple cleansing. Their spies have followed the teacher's movements, documenting his words and actions. Their agents have infiltrated the crowds that gather around him. Their plans have been frustrated only by the popular support that makes public arrest too risky. Judas stands before them with the composure of a man who has rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. The treasurer who has managed the disciples' funds now prepares to negotiate the price of his teacher's life. The mathematics of betrayal reduced to a simple transaction between willing parties. Caiaphas speaks first, his voice carrying the smooth authority of practiced leadership. What brings one of the Galileans' inner circle to their council chamber? What information does he possess that might serve the cause of public order? What assistance can he provide in resolving the problem that Jesus represents? The high priest's questions probe carefully, testing the depth of Judas's commitment to his new course. These religious leaders have dealt with informants before. They understand the psychology of betrayal, the mixture of grievance and self-interest that drives men to abandon their former loyalties. Judas responds with the directness that has always characterized his speech. He knows where Jesus can be found away from the protective crowds. He understands the teacher's habits and preferences. He can deliver him into their hands without the public disturbance they fear. The room falls silent as the implications of his offer sink in. Here stands the solution to their most pressing problem. The troublesome rabbi from Nazareth has placed himself beyond their reach through popular support. But one of his own disciples now offers to bridge that gap. Yet these experienced politicians proceed with caution. What guarantees can Judas provide? What assurance do they have that this is not some elaborate trap? What evidence exists of his genuine commitment to their cause? The treasurer's answers reveal the depth of his disillusionment with Jesus' methods. He speaks of a teacher who wastes resources that could serve the poor. He describes a leader who courts disaster rather than building strategic alliances. He portrays a movement that has lost its way through impractical idealism. But the religious leaders hear something beyond mere criticism in Judas's words. They detect the pain of disappointed expectations, the anger of betrayed trust, the frustration of a practical man watching his investments crumble. These emotions make him valuable as more than just an informant. The negotiation proceeds with the careful precision that marks all significant transactions. What exactly does Judas propose to do? When and where can the arrest take place? How will he ensure that the right person is identified in the darkness? The treasurer's plan demonstrates the thorough thinking that has made him effective in managing the disciples' affairs. He knows that Jesus often withdraws to the Garden of Gethsemane for prayer. The location offers privacy for arrest without the complications of crowd control. The timing can be arranged to minimize public awareness. But the matter of identification presents unique challenges. Darkness will make recognition difficult for temple guards unfamiliar with Jesus' appearance. The disciples typically dress alike and share similar physical characteristics. A clear signal will be necessary to prevent confusion. Judas proposes the kiss of greeting, a gesture so natural that it will arouse no suspicion from the other disciples. The intimacy of the act will ensure unmistakable identification. The cultural appropriateness will provide perfect camouflage for treachery. The religious leaders appreciate the elegance of this solution. The kiss transforms an act of affection into an instrument of betrayal. It uses the bonds of fellowship to accomplish the destruction of fellowship. It perverts love into the service of hate with artistic precision. Now comes the question that reduces every human transaction to its essential elements. What payment does Judas expect for his services? How much is the teacher's life worth to the one who claims to love him? What price will purchase the loyalty of a trusted disciple? The treasurer's answer reveals both calculation and contempt. 30 pieces of silver, the price set by law for a slave accidentally killed by someone else's ox. The amount suggests that he values Jesus no higher than a piece of property whose loss merits only minimal compensation. Yet the symbolism cuts deeper than mere financial calculation. 30 pieces of silver echo through Jewish memory as the price Zechariah received for his prophetic ministry, the wages paid to one whom the people despised. The amount carries prophetic weight that perhaps even Judas does not fully comprehend. The religious leaders accept his terms without negotiation. 30 pieces of silver represents a modest investment in solving their most pressing problem. The amount is significant enough to motivate genuine cooperation, but small enough to avoid financial strain. The price seems appropriate for purchasing a troublesome rabbi's destruction. The coins they count into Judas's hands carry more than monetary value. Each piece of silver represents a choice made and a bridge burned. The transaction transforms the treasurer from disciple to enemy, from follower to betrayer, from friend to Judas. The weight of the coins in his palm feels heavier than their physical substance should warrant. 30 pieces of silver buy more than information and opportunity. They purchase a place in history that will echo through every generation until the end of time. Yet Judas accepts the money with steady hands and clear eyes. The practical man in him recognizes a fair transaction between willing parties. The disillusioned disciple in him sees justice for a teacher who has squandered every opportunity. The calculating treasurer in him appreciates resources that provide options his former loyalty could not offer. The meeting concludes with arrangements for communication and coordination. Judas will send word when the optimal moment arrives. The temple guards will be prepared to act swiftly and decisively. The arrest will be accomplished with minimal disruption to public order. As he prepares to leave, the high priest offers final assurances about their mutual interests. The religious leaders have no desire to harm an innocent man. They simply need to question Jesus about his teachings and activities. Justice will be served according to proper legal procedures. These words provide Judas with the rationalization his conscience requires. He is not betraying his teacher to death, but to justice. He is not destroying Jesus, but saving him from his own destructive impulses. He is not committing treachery, but performing a service that benefits everyone involved. The treasurer walks back through Jerusalem's narrow streets with 30 pieces of silver weighing down his purse. The coins clink together with each step, creating a rhythm that will haunt his remaining days. The sound echoes off stone walls like the tolling of a bell announcing approaching doom. The night air carries the scent of cooking fires and incense from the temple. Pilgrims continue their festival celebrations, unaware that history pivots on the transaction just completed. The city sleeps fitfully, dreaming of liberation while betrayal walks among its shadows. Judas returns to where the other disciples wait, his face revealing nothing of the choice he has made. The money bag at his side carries more than their usual modest funds. Hidden among the familiar coins rest 30 pieces of silver that have purchased a teacher's life and a disciple's damnation. The die has been cast. The wheel has been set in motion. The kiss waits in the garden like a destiny that cannot be avoided. What began with disappointed expectations has become a transaction that will echo through eternity. The treasurer has made his bargain, and the price will prove higher than he ever imagined. Tomorrow will bring the Passover meal, the final gathering of the teacher with his disciples. But tonight, while others sleep in peace, Judas lies awake, counting the cost of the choice he has made. 30 pieces of silver buy a night's work, but the payment will last forever. The garden waits. The kiss approaches. And in the space between intention and action, between betrayal planned and betrayal accomplished, a man named Judas Iscariot discovers that some transactions cost more than money can ever repay. The Last Supper. Evening shadows stretched across Jerusalem as Jesus gathered his 12 closest followers for what would become the most remembered meal in history. The room filled with warm lamplight, casting gentle glows on familiar faces. Each disciple found his place around the low table, unaware that this gathering would echo through centuries. The meal began like countless others they had shared. Bread passed from hand to hand, wine poured into simple cups. Yet something different hung in the air tonight. Jesus moved with quiet purpose, his words carrying weight that made even restless hearts grow still. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jesus rose from his place, removed his outer garment, and took a basin of water. One by one, he knelt before each disciple, washing their feet with the tenderness of a servant. The room fell silent except for the gentle splash of water and the soft rustle of cloth. When Jesus reached Judas, their eyes met. The teacher's hands, that soon to be pierced, cradled the feet of his betrayer with the same care he showed to John, to Peter, to all the rest. Water flowed over dust-covered skin, and Jesus dried each foot with the towel around his waist. No words passed between them, but something profound occurred in that sacred space. Judas felt the weight of those gentle hands. Here was the man he had followed for 3 years, the one who had spoken of kingdoms and transformation, washing his feet like the lowliest servant. The contrast between Jesus' actions and Judas's hidden plans created a storm within his chest. After Jesus resumed his place, he broke bread with ceremonial precision. His words rang through the room like distant thunder. "This is my body, given for you." The disciples watched, captivated, as he lifted the cup. "This is my blood poured out for many." Each phrase seemed to carve itself into the very air around them. But then Jesus spoke words that froze every heart. "One of you will betray me." The statement fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the gathered men. Voices rose in protest, each disciple asking, "Lord, is it I?" The question revealed the deep trust they had in their teacher, but also their awareness of their own capacity for failure. Peter caught John's attention, motioning for him to ask Jesus who would commit this unthinkable act. John, reclining closest to Jesus, whispered the question. Jesus dipped a piece of bread in the dish and handed it to Judas. "What you are going to do quickly," he said, his voice carrying both sorrow and resolve. Judas received the morsel, and with it, the full weight of his decision crystallized. The bread felt heavy in his mouth, like swallowing stones. Around him, the other disciples continued their meal, but everything had changed. The warm room suddenly felt cold. The gentle lamplight seemed to flicker with shadows. Rising from the table, Judas moved toward the door. His footsteps echoed in the silence that followed Jesus' words. The other disciples watched him go, confusion written on their faces. Some assumed he was leaving to give money to the poor or to make purchases for the festival. None imagined the true purpose of his departure. As Judas stepped into the night, cool air struck his face. Behind him, the room continued to glow with warmth and fellowship. Ahead lay the path he had chosen, dark and uncertain. The 30 pieces of silver seemed to burn in his memory, their weight both lighter and heavier than he had expected. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Inside, Jesus continued teaching his remaining disciples, speaking of love, of unity, of the glory that would come through suffering. Outside, Judas walked through Jerusalem's narrow streets, his heart torn between the man he had just left and the bargain he had struck. Each step took him further from the upper room, further from the possibility of turning back. The city slept around him, unaware that history's greatest drama was about to unfold. Temple guards waited in the shadows, ready to follow him to the place where they could arrest Jesus away from the crowds. The contrast between the two scenes would haunt the imagination of believers for generations. Inside, Jesus washing feet and breaking bread in love. Outside, Judas walking toward betrayal through empty streets. Light and darkness, service and self-interest, loyalty and treachery, all converging on this single night. As Judas disappeared into the darkness, the Last Supper continued. But the circle of 12 had become 11, and nothing would ever be the same. The Garden of Gethsemane night wrapped around Jerusalem like a heavy cloak as Jesus led his disciples through the city's sleeping streets. Their destination lay beyond the walls, across the Kidron Valley, where ancient olive trees stood in silent witness to centuries of prayer and sorrow. The garden called Gethsemane would soon become the stage for humanity's greatest drama. The olive grove stretched before them, its gnarled branches reaching toward the star-filled sky. These trees had weathered countless storms, their twisted trunks telling stories of survival and endurance. Tonight, they would shelter the final hours of Jesus' freedom, their leaves rustling like whispered prayers in the gentle breeze. Jesus often came here with his disciples. The garden provided refuge from the crowds, a place where they could speak freely and rest without interruption. The disciples knew these paths well, could navigate them even in darkness. But tonight felt different. An invisible weight pressed down on the familiar space, making even the most confident among them uneasy. Leaving 8 disciples near the entrance, Jesus took Peter, James, and John deeper into the grove. These 3 had witnessed his transfiguration on the mountain, had seen him raise the dead, had heard him speak with Moses and Elijah. Now they would witness something entirely different, the full weight of human sorrow pressing down on their teacher. As they walked further into the garden, Jesus' demeanor changed. The strength that had sustained him through 3 years of ministry seemed to drain away. His shoulders sagged under invisible burden. His breathing grew labored, as if the very air had become thick and difficult to draw. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," Jesus told his 3 closest friends. The words came out heavy, like stones falling into deep water. "Stay here and keep watch with me." Then he moved away from them, going perhaps a stone's throw distance, far enough to be alone but close enough that they could still see his silhouette against the starlight. What happened next would echo through eternity. Jesus fell to his knees, then prostrated himself completely, his face touching the earth. His prayer rose from the depths of his being, raw and desperate. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Not as I will, but as you will." The disciples watched from their position, struggling to understand what they witnessed. They had seen Jesus calm storms and raise the dead, but they had never seen him like this. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and in the dim starlight it appeared to fall like drops of blood to the ground. His entire body seemed to strain against an invisible force. 3 times Jesus prayed the same prayer, each time wrestling with the path before him. Between each prayer, he returned to his disciples, finding them sleeping. Exhaustion had overcome them, but also a kind of spiritual weight that made staying awake nearly impossible. "Could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter, his voice carrying disappointment but also understanding. As the night deepened, another drama unfolded beyond the garden walls. Judas moved through Jerusalem's streets, leading a contingent of temple guards and Roman soldiers. Torches flickered in their hands, casting dancing shadows on the narrow pathways. The sound of their footsteps echoed off stone walls, a rhythm that seemed to count down the final moments of Jesus' freedom. The garden remained peaceful, unaware of the approaching storm. Olive branches swayed gently in the night breeze, their leaves creating a soft rustling that had soothed countless generations. The disciples dozed fitfully, their dreams troubled by visions they couldn't understand. Only Jesus remained fully awake, his prayers growing more intense with each passing hour. In the final moments before the arrest, a strange calm settled over the garden. Jesus rose from his knees, his prayer complete. The struggle was over. His face, streaked with sweat and tears, now showed peaceful resolution. He had wrestled with the will of God and emerged victorious, not through escape, but through acceptance. Walking back to his disciples, Jesus spoke with quiet authority. "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." The words carried no anger, only sad acknowledgement of what must come. The disciples stirred from their sleep, confusion clouding their faces as they tried to understand what was happening. Then they heard it, the sound of approaching footsteps, the murmur of voices, the clink of weapons. Torchlight began to flicker through the trees, growing brighter with each passing moment. The peaceful garden was about to become a battlefield, and the disciples' teacher was about to become a prisoner. But in those final moments of quiet, something profound had occurred. In the Garden of Gethsemane, surrounded by ancient olive trees and sleeping friends, Jesus had faced the full weight of human suffering and chosen love over escape, sacrifice over safety. The garden had witnessed the moment when divine will and human will became one, setting the stage for the greatest act of love in human history. The kiss and the arrest. Torchlight flickered between the olive trees as shadows moved through Gethsemane's ancient groves. The peaceful garden, moments before filled only with the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle breathing of sleeping disciples, now echoed with the sound of approaching footsteps. A crowd emerged from the darkness. Temple guards, Roman soldiers, and religious leaders, all familiar figure who walked at their head. Judas moved with purpose through the garden paths he knew so well. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird, each beat reminding him of the choice he had made. The 30 pieces of silver felt heavy in his memory, their weight transforming from promise to burden with each step toward his teacher. The plan seemed simple enough. In the darkness, with many people present, the guards needed a clear signal to identify their target. Jesus looked like any other Jewish teacher. No crown, no royal robes, no distinguishing marks that would set him apart in the flickering torchlight. A kiss would solve this problem, a common greeting between rabbi and student that would appear natural while serving a darker purpose. As the crowd approached, Jesus stepped forward to meet them. His disciples stirred from their sleep, confusion written across their faces as they tried to understand what was happening. The peaceful night had transformed into something else entirely, and they found themselves thrust into a scene they had never imagined. "Greetings, Rabbi," Judas said, his voice carrying across the garden air. The words sounded normal, even warm, but they carried the weight of betrayal. He approached Jesus with the easy familiarity of 3 years of friendship, 3 years of shared meals and long conversations and quiet moments of teaching. Then came the kiss. Judas leaned forward and pressed his lips to Jesus' cheek, a gesture that had passed between them countless times before. But this kiss was different. It carried the poison of betrayal, the bitter taste of 30 pieces of silver, the weight of a decision that would echo through eternity. Jesus received the kiss without pulling away. "Friend," he said quietly, his voice carrying both sadness and acceptance, "do what you came to do." The word friend hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor blessing, but something far more complex, a recognition of what had been and what was now lost. The moment stretched like a held breath. For an instant, the garden held its peace. Then chaos erupted as the guards moved forward, their hands reaching for Jesus. The disciples finally understood what was happening, and their confusion transformed into panic and rage. Peter, always quick to act, drew his sword and swung at the nearest guard. The blade caught Malchus, the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. Blood flowed in the torchlight, and the crowd stepped back, suddenly aware that these simple fishermen might not surrender their teacher without a fight. But Jesus stepped between his disciples and the guards, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Put your sword back in its place," he told Peter, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." Then, in a gesture that shocked everyone present, Jesus touched Malchus's wounded ear and healed it completely. The bleeding stopped, the ear restored, the violence undone by an act of compassion. The crowd stood stunned. Even in his arrest, Jesus continued to heal rather than harm. The contrast between his actions and theirs became stark in the flickering torchlight. They had come with swords and clubs to arrest a teacher who healed his enemies. "Am I leading a rebellion?" Jesus asked the crowd, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me there. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns." His words carried both challenge and surrender, questioning their methods while accepting their outcome. The guards moved forward again, more cautiously this time. They bound Jesus' hands with rough rope, the same hands that had blessed children and healed the sick. As they led him away, the disciples scattered into the darkness, their courage failing them in the face of armed opposition. Judas watched from the shadows as his teacher was led away. The kiss still burned on his lips, its intimacy now transformed into something horrible. He had expected to feel relief, perhaps even satisfaction, but instead found only a growing emptiness in his chest. The silver coins seemed to mock him now, their weight insufficient to balance the weight of what he had done. The garden fell quiet again as the crowd disappeared into the night. Only the olive trees remained, their ancient branches having witnessed another moment of human betrayal. The leaves continued their gentle rustling, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded beneath their shelter. Jesus walked between his captors, his steps steady despite the bonds on his wrists. Behind him, the Garden of Gethsemane held its secrets, the prayers that had been prayed, the tears that had been shed, the kiss that had changed everything. Ahead lay mockery and suffering, but also the fulfillment of a love that would not be deterred. The betrayer's kiss had done its work. The arrest was complete. But in the twisted irony of that dark night, the very act meant to destroy would become the foundation of hope for millions yet to come. Aftermath. The night unravels. The torchlight procession wound through Jerusalem's narrow streets like a serpent of flame, carrying Jesus toward the high priest's house. Behind them, the Garden of Gethsemane stood empty, its ancient olive trees returning to their silent vigil. The disciples had scattered into the darkness, their courage evaporating like morning mist under the harsh reality of armed guards and brutal authority. Judas followed at a distance, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had set in motion. The 30 pieces of silver no longer seemed like payment for services rendered. They felt more like blood money, burning in his memory with each step he took through the sleeping city. The kiss still lingered on his lips, transformed from a gesture of greeting into something far more sinister. The high priest's courtyard buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Servants hurried about with lamps and torches, their faces bright with excitement and curiosity. Word had spread quickly through the religious establishment. The troublesome teacher from Nazareth had finally been captured. The man who had challenged their authority, who had driven merchants from the temple, who had spoken against their traditions, was now bound and helpless. Jesus stood in the center of the courtyard, his hands tied behind his back, surrounded by guards who seemed almost afraid to touch him. Even in captivity, something about his presence made hardened soldiers step back slightly. His eyes, calm and steady, surveyed the scene without fear or anger. He appeared more like a king holding court than a prisoner awaiting judgment. The religious leaders began to gather, their robes rustling in the cool night air. These were the same men who had plotted his arrest, who had paid Judas his silver coins, who had waited for the right moment to strike. Now their moment had arrived, and they moved with the confidence of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Judas positioned himself where he could watch the proceedings without being noticed. Part of him hoped to see Jesus escape, to witness another miracle that would undo the betrayal. But another part of him, the part that had grown frustrated with Jesus' refusal to claim political power, wanted to see what would happen when the religious leaders confronted their captive. The questioning began almost immediately. High priest Caiaphas, his face stern in the flickering torchlight, demanded answers about Jesus' teachings and his disciples. But Jesus remained largely silent, his responses measured and careful. When he did speak, his words carried the same authority that had amazed crowds in the temple courts. Witnesses stepped forward, their testimonies contradicting each other in their eagerness to please the religious leaders. Some claimed Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple. Others insisted he had claimed to be the Messiah. But their stories didn't align, and their obvious enthusiasm for condemnation made their words suspect even to those who wanted to believe them. As the hours passed, Judas watched his teacher maintain his dignity, despite the mockery and accusations. No miracle came to rescue him, no angels descended from heaven, no sudden revelation transformed the hearts of his accusers. Instead, Jesus endured their questions with the same patience he had shown to honest seekers and hostile critics alike. The realization began to dawn on Judas like a slow, terrible sunrise. This was really happening. The man he had followed for 3 years, the teacher who had spoken of love and forgiveness, was going to be condemned by the very religious leaders who claimed to serve God. The silver coins had bought not just an arrest, but a path toward execution. In the corner of the courtyard, Peter warmed himself by a fire, trying to blend in with the servants and guards. 3 times, people recognized him as one of Jesus' disciples. 3 times he denied knowing his teacher. The third denial came with curses and oaths, his voice carrying across the courtyard in the quiet before dawn. At that moment, Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. Their eyes met across the crowded courtyard, and in that gaze, Peter saw not condemnation but profound sadness. The rooster crowed, its call echoing off the stone walls, and Peter remembered Jesus' prediction. He fled into the night, weeping bitterly. Judas watched Peter's departure with growing horror. If Peter, the boldest of the disciples, had denied Jesus, what hope remained? The other disciples had scattered like leaves in a storm. The crowds that had welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem were nowhere to be found. The teacher who had seemed so powerful now stood alone, abandoned by everyone except his captors. The interrogation continued as dawn approached. Jesus' silence frustrated his questioners, but it also revealed something profound. He was not defending himself because he had already accepted what was to come. The prayers in Gethsemane had settled the matter. This was not a trial he intended to win through clever arguments or appeals to justice. As the sky began to lighten, the religious leaders made their decision. Jesus would be handed over to the Roman authorities for execution. The charge would be claiming to be a king, a political crime that would ensure swift and brutal punishment. They had achieved their goal. The troublesome teacher would be silenced forever. But even as they celebrated their victory, something was wrong. The night had not unfolded as anyone expected. Jesus had not pleaded for mercy or offered to compromise. His followers had not mounted a rescue. The dramatic confrontation they had imagined had become something else entirely, a quiet display of dignity in the face of injustice. Judas felt the weight of realization settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had betrayed an innocent man. The 30 pieces of silver had purchased not justice, but a mockery of it. The kiss in the garden had sealed the fate of someone who had shown him nothing but kindness and trust. As the sun began to rise over Jerusalem, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Judas turned away from the scene. He could no longer bear to watch what he had set in motion. The night was over, but the day ahead promised even greater horrors, and he knew with growing certainty that he had chosen the wrong side. Dawn broke over Jerusalem with cruel beauty, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, while the city below awakened to the darkest day in its history. The sun's rays struck the temple walls with their usual splendor, but for Judas, the light brought no comfort. Instead, it illuminated the full magnitude of what he had done, casting shadows that seemed to reach into his very soul. The night had passed in a blur of testimonies and condemnations. Jesus, bound and mocked, had been passed from the high priest's house to Pilate's judgment hall. The religious leaders moved with swift efficiency, determined to see their plan through to its bitter conclusion. But as morning arrived, the weight of their actions began to settle on all involved. Judas wandered through Jerusalem's streets like a ghost, his feet carrying him without conscious direction. The familiar pathways that had once brought him joy now felt like a maze with no exit. Every corner reminded him of moments spent with Jesus, places where they had eaten together, streets where they had walked in fellowship, courtyards where they had listened to their teacher's words. The 30 pieces of silver weighed heavy in his pouch, each coin a reminder of his betrayal. He had thought the money would bring him satisfaction, perhaps even a sense of accomplishment. Instead, it burned like molten metal against his side, impossible to ignore or forget. The silver that had once seemed like fair payment now felt like the price of his own soul. News traveled quickly through the narrow streets. Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher who had attracted such crowds, had been arrested and condemned. The religious leaders had handed him over to the Roman authorities, accusing him of claiming to be a king. The punishment for such a crime was well known: crucifixion, the most shameful and painful way to die. Each piece of information struck Judas like a physical blow. This was not what he had intended. He had thought the religious leaders would question Jesus, perhaps imprison him for a time, maybe force him to moderate his claims. But execution? The complete destruction of the man who had spoken of love and forgiveness? The finality of it overwhelmed him. As the morning progressed, Judas found himself drawn back to the temple, the place where he had struck his bargain. The religious leaders bustled about with renewed energy, their faces bright with satisfaction. They had achieved their goal. The troublesome teacher would soon be silenced forever. But when they saw Judas approaching, their expressions grew cold. "I have betrayed innocent blood," Judas declared, his voice carrying across the temple courts. The words came out harsh and desperate, torn from the depths of his anguish. The religious leaders turned to face him, but their eyes showed no compassion, only irritation at this interruption to their plans. He pulled the silver coins from his pouch, the metal catching the morning light as he held them out. "Take back your money," he pleaded, his hands trembling. "I cannot keep what I earned through betrayal. The man is innocent. I have done wrong." The coins clinked together in his shaking palms, their sound now repulsive to his ears. The religious leaders exchanged glances, their expressions revealing nothing but cold calculation. "What is that to us?" they replied, their voices carrying the weight of dismissal. "That is your responsibility." They turned away from him, making it clear that they considered the matter closed. The deal had been struck, the arrest accomplished, the silver earned. Judas stared at them in disbelief. These were the spiritual leaders of his people, the men who claimed to represent God's will. Yet now, faced with his confession and repentance, they showed no mercy, no willingness to acknowledge the injustice they had set in motion. Their hearts had hardened beyond the reach of conscience. With a cry of anguish, Judas hurled the silver coins onto the temple floor. They scattered across the polished stone, their metallic ringing echoing through the sacred space. The sound seemed to mock him, each coin singing its own note of condemnation. The money rolled in different directions, some disappearing into corners, others spinning slowly before coming to rest. The religious leaders watched the scene with detached interest. After Judas fled, they gathered the scattered coins, discussing what to do with them. "It is against the law to put this into the treasury," they decided, "since it is blood money." Even they recognized the tainted nature of the silver, though they felt no responsibility for the blood that had purchased it. Judas ran from the temple, his heart breaking with each step. The city streets, once familiar and welcoming, now felt like a prison. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of Jesus, the places where they had walked, the people they had helped, the moments of joy they had shared. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him like a mountain. The realization hit him with devastating force. He had not just betrayed a teacher or a friend. He had betrayed love itself, had sold out the very embodiment of everything he claimed to value. The man who had washed his feet, who had shared bread with him, who had called him friend even in the moment of betrayal, this man was now condemned to die because of his actions. Regret filled his chest like poison, making each breath painful. He had thought he could live with his choice, had convinced himself that he was serving a greater good. But now, faced with the reality of what he had done, he found the burden unbearable. The silver coins were gone, returned to those who had offered them, but the weight of betrayal remained. As he walked through Jerusalem's streets, Judas felt the eyes of the city upon him. Word of his betrayal had spread, and people pointed at him with mixture of fear and disgust. He had become a symbol of treachery, a name that would be whispered with revulsion for generations to come. The man who had once stood among Jesus' inner circle now stood alone, abandoned by all. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but for Judas the day grew darker with each passing hour. Somewhere in the city, Jesus was being prepared for execution, carrying the cross that would become the symbol of ultimate sacrifice. And Judas, the betrayer, carried his own cross, the weight of regret and despair that would crush his spirit beyond repair. The death of Judas. The sun climbed higher over Jerusalem, its golden rays illuminating a city that buzzed with activity and whispered rumors. News of Jesus' arrest had spread like wildfire through the narrow streets, and crowds began to gather along the path where condemned prisoners traditionally carried their crosses. But for Judas, the growing excitement in the city only deepened his despair. After fleeing the temple, his rejected silver coins scattered across the floor behind him, Judas wandered through Jerusalem like a man lost in a nightmare. The familiar streets felt foreign now, as if the very stones beneath his feet had turned against him. Every face he passed seemed to carry accusation. Every whisper seemed to speak his name with contempt. The weight of his betrayal pressed down on him with each step. He had thought he could live with his choice, had convinced himself that he was serving some greater purpose. But now, faced with the reality of Jesus' condemnation, he found the burden unbearable. The man who had shown him nothing but kindness and trust was going to die because of his actions. Judas's mind raced through the past 3 years, remembering moments that now carried bitter significance. Jesus washing his feet at the Last Supper, the teacher's gentle hands caring for the one who would betray him, the countless meals they had shared, the roads they had walked together, the quiet conversations in the evening hours when the other disciples had fallen asleep. Each memory felt like a knife turning in his chest. He had been more than just a follower. He had been chosen, trusted, given responsibility for the group's finances. Jesus had believed in him, had seen something worthy in him when others might have looked past the tax collector's son. And this was how he had repaid that trust. The city's noise faded as Judas found himself walking toward the outskirts of Jerusalem. His feet carried him without conscious direction, moving away from the crowds and the whispers, seeking some place where he might escape the weight of his guilt. But the burden followed him, growing heavier with each step. He thought of the other disciples, scattered and afraid after the arrest. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, but at least he had wept for his betrayal. The others had fled in terror, but they had not orchestrated their teacher's capture. Only Judas bore the unique weight of premeditated betrayal, of planning and executing the destruction of the man who had loved him. The path led him to a field outside the city walls, a place where farmers had once worked the soil, but which now lay fallow and forgotten. Ancient olive trees dotted the landscape, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. The silence here was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Judas sank to his knees in the middle of the field, his strength finally giving way to despair. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down his face as the full weight of his actions crashed over him. He had betrayed the Son of God, had sold out the very embodiment of love for 30 pieces of silver. The silver was gone, returned to those who had offered it, but the betrayal remained. He thought of Jesus' words from the upper room, "What you are going to do, do quickly." Even then, in that moment of devastating revelation, the teacher had shown no anger, no condemnation. He had simply acknowledged what was to come, accepting it with the same grace he had shown to everyone else. The contrast between Jesus' response and his own growing despair was unbearable. Rising to his feet, Judas looked around the empty field. The solitude that had seemed like refuge now felt like judgment. The very earth seemed to reject him, the sky to frown down upon his actions. He was alone in the universe, cut off from God, from his fellow disciples, from any hope of redemption. The ancient accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but they agree on the essential tragedy. Matthew's gospel records that Judas hanged himself, unable to bear the weight of his guilt. The book of Acts describes his death differently, saying he fell headlong and his body burst open. These variations in the telling do not diminish the central truth. Judas's despair proved stronger than his hope. Whether by rope or by fall, Judas's life ended in that field outside Jerusalem. The man who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had witnessed miracles and heard teachings that would transform the world, could not find his way to the forgiveness that his teacher had offered, even to his enemies. The tragedy was not just in his betrayal, but in his inability to believe in the possibility of redemption. The field where Judas died became known as the Field of Blood, purchased with the 30 pieces of silver that the religious leaders could not keep in their treasury. The money that had been intended to silence Jesus instead became a monument to the consequences of betrayal. The silver coins, rejected by both buyer and seller, served their final purpose in purchasing a burial ground for strangers. News of Judas's death spread through Jerusalem as the city prepared for the execution of Jesus. Some received the news with satisfaction, seeing divine justice in the betrayer's end. Others felt only sadness at the waste of a life that had been touched by the divine but had chosen darkness over light. The man who had been numbered among the 12 was now numbered among the dead. As the sun reached its zenith over Jerusalem, casting short shadows in the empty field, Judas's body lay still beneath the olive trees. The betrayal was complete. The betrayer was gone, but the story was far from over. The man he had betrayed would soon transform even this ultimate act of treachery into something redemptive, showing that love could triumph even over the darkest human failure. The field stood silent, a testament to the price of betrayal and the tragedy of despair. But in the distance, Jerusalem buzzed with activity as another drama unfolded, the drama of sacrifice and redemption that would give meaning to even the darkest chapters of human failure. Legacy in Scripture. The evening shadows lengthened over Jerusalem as scribes and scholars gathered in small groups, their voices hushed as they discussed the day's events. The crucifixion of Jesus had shaken the city to its core, and now, in the quiet hours after the storm, people began to process what they had witnessed. Among the stories that would be told and retold, the tale of Judas's betrayal held a special place of horror and fascination. Within decades, the gospel writers would set down their accounts, each one grappling with the mystery of how one of Jesus' chosen disciples could have orchestrated his teacher's arrest. These early Christian writers faced a profound challenge: how to explain the inexplicable, how to make sense of betrayal from within the inner circle of trust. Matthew, writing perhaps for a Jewish audience familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, saw connections between Judas's actions and the prophecies of old. The 30 pieces of silver echoed the price of a slave in the law of Moses, while the potter's field purchased with blood money recalled the words of Jeremiah and Zechariah. For Matthew, Judas's betrayal was not just a historical event, but a fulfillment of divine plan, woven into the fabric of Scripture itself. The Gospel of Matthew presents Judas as a man driven by greed, motivated by the silver coins that would purchase his teacher's arrest. But this portrayal goes deeper than simple avarice. Matthew shows us a man who remains close to Jesus until the very end, who participates in the Last Supper, who receives the sop directly from his teacher's hand. The betrayal comes not from an enemy, but from a friend, making it all the more devastating. Mark, traditionally considered the earliest gospel, treats Judas with stark brevity. The betrayer appears in the narrative only when necessary, identified simply as one of the 12. Mark's account emphasizes the shock of the betrayal rather than its psychology. The very fact that the betrayer was numbered among the chosen disciples makes the treachery more profound, more incomprehensible. Luke, the physician and careful historian, provides additional details that reveal the complexity of Judas's character. It was Luke who recorded Jesus' words about Satan entering into Judas, suggesting that the betrayal involved spiritual forces beyond mere human weakness. Yet Luke also shows us Judas's remorse, his attempt to return the silver coins, his recognition that he had betrayed innocent blood. The Gospel of John, written later and with deeper theological reflection, presents perhaps the most complex portrait of Judas. John identifies him as the group's treasurer, the one who carried the money bag and sometimes complained about extravagant expenses. But John also shows us Jesus' foreknowledge of the betrayal, his acceptance of it as necessary to the divine plan, and his continued treatment of Judas with dignity, even in the moment of treachery. These four gospel accounts, while differing in emphasis and detail, agree on the essential elements of Judas's story. He was one of the 12 chosen by Jesus himself, trusted with responsibility, present at the most intimate moments of Jesus' ministry. His betrayal came not from ignorance or distance, but from knowledge and proximity. The differences in the gospel accounts reflect the various ways early Christians tried to understand this tragedy. Some emphasize the fulfillment of prophecy, seeing God's hand even in human treachery. Others focused on the psychological aspects, trying to understand what could drive a man to betray his teacher. Still others saw spiritual warfare, the forces of darkness working through human weakness. What emerges from these scriptural accounts is not a simple villain, but a complex figure who embodies the capacity for both good and evil that exists in every human heart. Judas was not a monster from the beginning, but a man who made choices, each one leading him further from the light he had once followed. The book of Acts adds another dimension to Judas's legacy, describing his death in terms that emphasize divine judgment. The field purchased with blood money becomes a symbol of the consequences of betrayal, while the selection of Matthias to replace Judas in the 12 demonstrates the community's need to heal from the wound of treachery. Later New Testament writings would reflect on Judas's role in salvation history. Paul's letters, while not mentioning Judas by name, grapple with the mystery of how God's purposes can be fulfilled even through human sin. The betrayal that seemed to threaten the mission of Jesus actually becomes instrumental in its completion. The gospel writers were careful to preserve the humanity of Judas, even as they recorded his treachery. They show us his remorse, his recognition of his wrong, his attempt to undo what he had done. These details suggest that even in his darkest moment, Judas retained some capacity for moral recognition, some understanding of the gravity of his actions. The theological weight of Judas's story would resonate through centuries of Christian thought. Early church fathers would debate whether Judas's betrayal was predestined or freely chosen, whether he could have been saved despite his actions, whether his role in salvation history made him necessary or simply tragic. The scriptural accounts refuse to give easy answers to these questions. They present Judas as simultaneously instrument and agent, victim and perpetrator, necessary and culpable. This complexity has made him one of the most fascinating and troubling figures in Christian scripture. What the gospel writers achieved in their accounts of Judas was the creation of a character who embodies the deepest questions about human nature and divine purpose. Through their different perspectives and emphases, they crafted a portrait that has challenged readers for 2 millennia. The legacy of Judas in Scripture is not just the record of a historical betrayal, but a meditation on the mystery of human choice and divine sovereignty. His story becomes a mirror in which readers can examine their own capacity for both loyalty and treachery, their own struggles with doubt and despair. In the end, the scriptural accounts of Judas serve not just as historical record, but as theological reflection, inviting each generation to wrestle with the profound questions his story raises about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the complex relationship between human freedom and divine will. Judas in early Christian thought. The flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls of the underground meeting place where early Christians gathered to worship and discuss the profound mysteries of their faith. Among the topics that stirred the deepest debate was the figure of Judas Iscariot, the disciple whose betrayal had made possible their Lord's crucifixion and, they believed, their salvation. These early believers faced a theological puzzle that would challenge Christian thinkers for centuries. How could they understand the role of the betrayer in God's plan? Was Judas a villain to be despised, or was he somehow an instrument of divine purpose? The questions were not merely academic, they touched the very heart of what it meant to believe in a God who could bring good out of evil. The Apostolic Fathers, those early Christian leaders who had known the apostles personally or had been taught by their direct disciples, approached the Judas question with careful reverence. They understood that they were dealing with sacred mystery, not simple moral judgment. Their writings reveal a community to comprehend how betrayal could serve divine purposes. Clement of Rome, writing in the first century, saw Judas as a cautionary tale about the dangers of spiritual pride and the importance of perseverance in faith. For Clement, Judas represented the possibility that even those closest to Jesus could fall away if they allowed their hearts to be hardened by sin. The betrayal served as a warning to all believers about the need for constant vigilance against spiritual corruption. Justin Martyr, the philosopher who became a Christian apologist, viewed Judas through the lens of prophecy and divine foreknowledge. In his writings, Judas becomes a figure whose actions were foretold in the Hebrew Scriptures, making him both responsible for his choices and instrumental in fulfilling God's plan. This perspective allowed early Christians to see the betrayal as both human failure and divine providence. The developing theology of the early church began to grapple with the paradox of Judas's necessary betrayal. If Jesus had to die for the sins of humanity, then someone had to betray him. This raised uncomfortable questions about predestination and free will that would echo through centuries of Christian thought. Some early theologians argued that Judas was chosen for his role, while others insisted that he chose it himself. Irenaeus, the 2nd century bishop and theologian, wrote extensively about Judas in his work against heresies. He saw the betrayer as a figure who revealed the true nature of evil, not as a creative force, but as a corruption of good. For Irenaeus, Judas had been given every opportunity to choose righteousness, but had instead chosen to serve his own desires. The early Christian community also had to deal with the practical implications of Judas's betrayal. How should they treat those who had betrayed their fellow believers during times of persecution? The figure of Judas became a reference point for discussions about forgiveness, restoration, and the limits of Christian mercy. Origen, the brilliant 3rd century theologian, offered perhaps the most complex early interpretation of Judas. He suggested that the betrayer's actions were part of a cosmic drama in which even evil ultimately serves good purposes. This perspective allowed Christians to see Judas not as an enemy of God, but as an unwitting servant of divine will. The question of Judas's eternal fate became another source of theological debate. Some early Christians believed that his suicide precluded any possibility of redemption, while others wondered whether God's mercy might extend even to the betrayer. These discussions revealed the tension between justice and mercy that has always characterized Christian thought. The writings of the early church fathers reveal a community that refused to demonize Judas completely. They recognized his humanity, his capacity for both good and evil, his tragic end. This nuanced approach prevented the early church from creating a simple scapegoat and instead forced believers to confront the reality of human weakness and divine grace. Augustine, whose influence on Christian thought cannot be overstated, wrote extensively about Judas in his commentaries on the Gospels. He saw the betrayer as a figure who demonstrated the mystery of divine election and human responsibility. For Augustine, Judas was both chosen and choosing, both instrument and agent, both victim and perpetrator. The early Christian understanding of Judas was also shaped by their experience of persecution and martyrdom. Many believers faced the choice between betraying their faith and facing death. The figure of Judas became a symbol of the ultimate betrayal, the choice that led not to physical death but to spiritual destruction. The developing liturgy of the early church also reflected this complex understanding of Judas. He was remembered not with hatred, but with sorrow, not as a monster, but as a tragic figure whose story served as a warning and a reminder of human frailty. The prayers and hymns of the early church often included references to the betrayer that emphasized both his guilt and his humanity. The early Christian approach to Judas reveals a community that was willing to wrestle with difficult questions rather than accepting easy answers. They understood that the betrayer's story was not just about one man's failure, but about the universal human condition, the capacity for both good and evil that exists in every heart. This theological sophistication would influence how Christians understood not only Judas, but also the nature of evil itself. The early church's refusal to reduce the betrayer to a simple villain opened the door for deeper reflection on the mysteries of divine providence and human freedom. The legacy of early Christian thought about Judas is a reminder that the most profound theological questions often arise from the most troubling human experiences. In wrestling with the mystery of the betrayer, the early church developed insights that would shape Christian understanding for centuries to come. Judas across history and art. The cathedral's soaring arches stretched toward heaven, their stone surfaces adorned with intricate carvings that told the story of salvation and damnation. Among these artistic treasures, the figure of Judas appeared again and again, his face etched in stone and paint, his story retold through the creative vision of countless artists across the centuries. Medieval sculptors and painters found in Judas a subject that allowed them to explore the depths of human emotion and spiritual struggle. Unlike the serene faces of saints or the triumphant poses of biblical heroes, Judas offered artists the opportunity to portray anguish, remorse, and the terrible weight of irreversible choice. His face became a canvas for depicting the most profound human experiences of guilt and despair. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe incorporated Judas into their elaborate sculptural programs, usually as part of larger scenes depicting the Passion of Christ. At Chartres, his figure appears in the famous tympanum, his face turned away from Christ in shame while his hands clutch the bag of silver coins. The medieval artists understood that Judas's story was not separate from the salvation narrative, but integral to it. Byzantine mosaics presented Judas with the formal dignity that characterized Eastern Christian art, but even in these stylized representations, the artists found ways to convey the spiritual drama of betrayal. The golden backgrounds that surrounded all figures made Judas's darkness more profound by contrast, his isolation more complete despite being surrounded by the other disciples. The Renaissance brought new psychological depth to artistic representations of Judas. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper revolutionized how the betrayer was portrayed, showing him not as an obvious villain, but as a complex figure whose guilt and fear were written in his body language and facial expression. Da Vinci's Judas recoils from Jesus' words, his hand grasping the money bag, while his face reflects the inner turmoil of a man caught between loyalty and treachery. Caravaggio's dramatic use of light and shadow found perfect expression in his paintings of Judas. The Italian master's technique of illuminating figures against dark backgrounds created scenes where Judas seemed to emerge from and disappear into darkness, symbolizing his spiritual journey from light to shadow. In The Taking of Christ, Caravaggio shows Judas in the act of betrayal, his face partially hidden but his gesture unmistakably treacherous. The Protestant Reformation brought new interpretations of Judas's role in salvation history, and these theological developments influenced artistic representations. Northern European artists like Albrecht Dürer created prints and paintings that emphasized Judas's humanity while not excusing his betrayal. These works often showed him alongside other disciples, emphasizing that the capacity for betrayal existed within the community of faith itself. Literature embraced Judas as a character who could embody the deepest questions about human nature and divine purpose. And Dante's Inferno placed Judas in the lowest circle of hell, frozen in the mouth of Satan alongside Brutus and Cassius, the other great betrayers of history. This literary treatment established Judas as the ultimate symbol of treachery, but even Dante's harsh judgment was tempered by the poet's recognition of the cosmic significance of the betrayal. Medieval mystery plays brought Judas to life on stage, allowing audiences to witness the progression from disciple to betrayer. These dramatic presentations often emphasize the psychological aspects of Judas's story, showing him as a man torn between competing loyalties and desires. The plays made Judas a figure of both horror and pity, someone whose fate served as a warning while also evoking sympathy. The ballads and folk songs of various cultures incorporated Judas into their repertoires, often focusing on his remorse and death rather than his betrayal. These popular treatments of the story revealed how ordinary people understood Judas, not as a monster, but as a tragic figure whose story carried lessons about the consequences of wrong choices. The Romantic period brought new emotional intensity to artistic representations of Judas. Painters like Eugène Delacroix portrayed the betrayer with the passionate intensity that characterized Romantic art, emphasizing the emotional drama of his story. These works often focused on moments of peak psychological tension: the kiss in the garden, the realization of his mistake, the despair that led to his death. Modern literature has continued to find in Judas a rich source of artistic inspiration. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges, Graham Greene, and Jose Saramago have created works that explore the theological and psychological dimensions of the betrayer's story. These modern treatments often question traditional interpretations, suggesting that Judas might have been misunderstood or that his betrayal served a necessary purpose. Contemporary artists have brought new perspectives to the figure of Judas, often emphasizing his humanity rather than his villainy. Sculptures and paintings in modern galleries present him as a complex figure whose story reflects universal human experiences of guilt, remorse, and the struggle between competing loyalties. The cinema has created some of the most powerful modern interpretations of Judas. Films like The Gospel According to St. Matthew and Jesus Christ Superstar have portrayed him as a three-dimensional character whose motivations and inner conflicts are as important as his actions. These cinematic treatments often emphasize the political and social context of his betrayal, making him a figure who reflects the complexities of his historical moment. The artistic legacy of Judas reveals how each generation has found in his story a mirror for their own struggles with faith, doubt, and moral choice. Whether portrayed as villain or tragic hero, as cosmic figure or human being, Judas continues to inspire artists who recognize in his story the profound questions that have always haunted human conscience. Through painting and sculpture, literature and drama, music and film, the figure of Judas has transcended his historical moment to become a universal symbol of the human capacity for both good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, love and destruction. His artistic legacy reminds us that the most profound truths about human nature are often found in the darkest chapters of our stories. The betrayer we all carry. The monastery bell tolled softly in the distance as the old monk sat in his simple cell, a worn copy of the Gospels open before him. The candlelight flickered across the familiar pages, illuminating once again the story of Judas Iscariot. After decades of study and prayer, the ancient words still carried their power to disturb and challenge, to reveal truths that reached beyond the confines of history into the depths of the human heart. The monk had read this story countless times, had preached about it, had counseled others who struggled with its implications. Yet tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, he found himself confronting the uncomfortable truth that every honest soul must eventually face: the recognition that the capacity for betrayal lives within us all. Judas represents more than a historical figure who orchestrated the arrest of Jesus. He embodies the shadow that follows every human heart, the possibility that even those who have walked closest to the light can choose darkness. His story is not just about one man's failure, but about the universal human condition, the tension between love and self-interest that defines so much of our existence. The monk reflected on the various interpretations of Judas's motivations that had emerged over the centuries. Some saw him as driven by simple greed, his betrayal motivated by the 30 pieces of silver. Others viewed him as a political revolutionary disappointed by Jesus' refusal to claim earthly power. Still others suggested he was driven by a complex mixture of motives: love and hate, hope and despair, loyalty and ambition, all warring within his heart. But perhaps the most disturbing interpretation was the one that saw Judas as fundamentally similar to the other disciples, distinguished not by his inherent evil, but by his choices. This perspective suggested that any of the 12 could have become the betrayer, that the seeds of treachery existed in every heart that followed Jesus. The selection of Judas was not predetermined, but emerged from the complex interplay of character, circumstance, and choice. The monk closed his eyes and searched his own heart, finding there the same capacity for betrayal that had destroyed Judas. How many times had he chosen his own comfort over the demands of love? How often had he remained silent when truth demanded speech, or spoken when wisdom counseled silence? The forms of betrayal were endless, and none of us could claim complete innocence. Yet the story of Judas also revealed something profound about the nature of divine love. Jesus had chosen Judas knowing what he would do, had washed his feet at the Last Supper, had called him friend, even in the moment of betrayal. This suggested that love does not withdraw in the face of treachery, but continues to extend itself even to those who reject it. The tragedy of Judas was not just his betrayal, but his inability to believe in the possibility of forgiveness. While Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, found his way back to the community of disciples, Judas chose despair over hope, death over the possibility of redemption. His death by suicide represented the ultimate betrayal, not of Jesus, but of the very grace that could have saved him. The monk pondered the theological implications of this tragedy. If Jesus had come to save sinners, then surely the betrayer was not beyond the reach of divine mercy. The failure of Judas was not in his sin, but in his refusal to believe that his sin could be forgiven. He had confused the weight of his guilt with the limits of God's grace. This insight carried profound implications for how we understand both divine mercy and human responsibility. The story of Judas suggests that no sin is too great for forgiveness, but it also reveals that forgiveness must be received to be effective. The grace that could have saved Judas was available to him, but he chose to reject it in favor of despair. The monk thought about the people who had come to him over the years, burdened by guilt and convinced that their failures had placed them beyond the reach of redemption. How many of them carried within their hearts the same despair that had destroyed Judas? How many had convinced themselves that their betrayals were unforgivable? In these moments of pastoral care, the monk had learned to point not to the despair of Judas, but to the restoration of Peter. Both disciples had failed their teacher, but their responses to failure had led to vastly different outcomes. Peter's tears of remorse had opened the door to forgiveness, while Judas's despair had closed it. The story of Judas also revealed the mysterious relationship between human freedom and divine sovereignty. The betrayal was both freely chosen and necessary for salvation, both the result of human weakness and the instrument of divine purpose. This paradox had troubled theologians for centuries, but it also pointed to a profound truth about the nature of existence itself. Perhaps the real lesson of Judas was not about the dangers of betrayal, but about the importance of hope. In a world where everyone has the capacity for treachery, where all of us carry within ourselves the seeds of our own destruction, the crucial question is not whether we will fail, but how we will respond to our failures. The monk opened his eyes and looked again at the gospel text. The story of Judas was indeed a dark chapter in the narrative of salvation, but it was not the end of the story. The betrayer's silver coins had purchased a field for burying strangers, but the one he betrayed had purchased life for all humanity. Even in the darkest moment of human failure, love had found a way to transform treachery into triumph. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the monastery window, the monk offered a prayer for all those who carried within themselves the burden of betrayal. He prayed for the grace to recognize the Judas within his own heart, and for the wisdom to choose Peter's path of repentance over Judas's path of despair. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest lesson of the betrayer's story, that even in our darkest moments, the possibility of redemption remains, waiting for us to choose hope over despair, love over fear, life over death. The bell tolled again, calling the community to morning prayer. The monk rose from his chair, leaving the gospel open on his desk, where the story of Judas would continue to challenge and disturb all who encountered it. The betrayer's tale would go on, carrying its uncomfortable truths into every heart, honest enough to recognize that we all carry within ourselves the capacity for both betrayal and redemption.